The people who stood closest to Diana knew things that no briefing produced and no official account contains. They were not journalists conducting interviews at a careful professional distance. They were the men assigned to stand 18 inches from her, in the corridors of Kensington Palace at midnight, in the back of armored cars on foreign tours, outside the doors of rooms where conversations happened that no one was supposed to hear. Protection officers see what courtiers cannot see and what the press cannot reach. They are present at the unscheduled hours, at the unmanaged conversations that happen when the public performance has stopped, and what remains is a person existing without institutional supervision. They carry that knowledge differently from every other kind of royal knowledge. It lives not in documents or correspondence, but in the memory of someone who was there. And memory, unlike paper, cannot be recalled, shredded, or classified. The palace understood this. It had understood it long enough to have developed responses consistent across multiple cases and multiple officers, organized around the same institutional interest each time. One man was transferred from Diana's detail with a speed that the people around her found difficult to interpret as routine rotation. He died in a motorcycle accident 6 weeks later. Another officer spent a decade at her side, published an account of what that decade contained, and found the institution's management of his words beginning before his book reached its readers. A third survived the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, and spent the following years describing what he remembered of that night, in terms that grew more circumscribed each time he was asked. A fourth man knew enough about Diana's private life that the Crown Prosecution Service put him on trial. The trial collapsed when the Queen personally intervened to disclose information that caused the case to be abandoned before a verdict was reached. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Each of these cases has been covered in separate reporting and in separate official investigations. The pattern connecting them has received considerably less attention. The institution's consistent response to the people who accumulated direct knowledge of Diana's private experience, documented across multiple cases and multiple forms of institutional response, is what this account examines. The sources are the public ones, the published accounts of the men who were inside the protection arrangements, the legal record of the proceedings that placed some of what they knew into documented form, the tapes Diana made for Andrew Morton in 1991 and that were released after her death. On those tapes, Diana said she believed one of her protection officers had been killed for knowing too much. She said it without the qualifications that people use when speaking about events they suspect but cannot prove. She believed it, and she believed it because she had watched the institution remove the man from her life and then learned, weeks later, that he was dead. Whether her conclusion was accurate is a question the official investigation examined, and the families involved have never fully accepted. Whether the pattern across the other cases is consistent with a systematic institutional management of people who came too close to the truth of Diana's experience is a question the official investigation did not address. This account addresses it. The Royal and Diplomatic Protection Group is the branch of the Metropolitan Police Service responsible for the physical security of the senior members of the royal family. Its officers are selected through a process that emphasizes operational competence, discretion, and the specific temperamental quality that the work requires, which is the ability to be continuously present without becoming a continuous presence in the psychological sense. The ideal protection officer, in the institution's understanding, is someone who sees everything and registers as background. They are the person in the photograph who is standing slightly to the left of the frame, in the dark jacket, facing the other direction. The ideal is not always achieved. It cannot always be achieved, because the work's requirements produce, over sustained periods, something that the ideal's description does not anticipate. Sustained physical proximity to another person, across months and then years of working arrangements, produces knowledge of that person that exceeds what the professional relationship was designed to contain. It produces it not through any failure of professional conduct, but through the simple mathematics of time and presence. The officer who travels with a principal across a 10-day overseas tour, who sits outside her door at 2 a.m. while she makes telephone calls she believes are private, who reads the environment around her continuously for threat and therefore reads her continuously as the most significant variable in that environment. That officer knows things about her that no one else in her life knows. They know her patterns, the specific hour at which anxiety typically arrives in her face before a public engagement, the way her voice changes when she is performing composure for an audience, and the way it sounds when she has stopped performing. The telephone calls she makes at hours that suggest the calls matter more than she is telling anyone, the people she is glad to see when they arrive, and the people she prepares herself to receive, the preparation visible to someone watching her closely enough and long enough to know the difference. Diana's protection arrangements across the 1980s and into the 90s involved a succession of officers who accumulated this kind of knowledge across their time with her. The accumulation was not planned by anyone. It was the product of the work itself, of the sustained proximity that the work required, and of Diana's specific relationship with the people performing it. Her relationship with her protection officers was different from the relationship that other principals in the royal family maintained with theirs. This is documented across multiple sources, in the published accounts of officers who served with her and in the accounts of people who observed the arrangements from adjacent positions. The difference was the difference between a principal who maintained the professional distance that the protection relationship formally requires, and a principal who did not maintain it, not out of professional ignorance but out of a specific understanding of her own situation. Diana understood, across the years of her marriage, that the people nearest to her in the institutional sense were the people least likely to provide her with the specific thing she needed most, which was an unmanaged human relationship with someone who was not performing a role in her direction. The courtiers were performing. The ladies' maids were performing. The palace officials were performing the specific performance of institutional service that the royal household's culture requires of everyone inside it, in which the principal's well-being is attended to through the mechanisms of duty and protocol, rather than through the mechanisms of genuine personal engagement. Her protection officers were performing too, in the technical sense that their professional role was a performance of watchfulness and risk management rather than personal companionship. But the performance of watchfulness is different in its human texture from the performance of courtly service. The watchful person is oriented toward the principal as a physical reality rather than as an institutional position. They read her body rather than her schedule. They respond to her mood rather than her diary. The intimacy of that orientation, sustained across months and years, produces a different quality of human relationship from the courtly service model, even when both people involved are attempting to maintain professional distance. Diana stopped attempting to maintain it with some of her officers. Ken Wharfe, who served as her principal protection officer from 1987 to 1993, has written and spoken extensively about the quality of the relationship that developed across those 6 years. His published account, Diana, Closely Guarded Secret, appeared in 2002 and drew on his direct experience of the protection arrangements across some of the most significant years of her marriage. He describes a principal who talked to him, genuinely talked, in the specific unguarded way that people talk to the witnesses they have stopped being able to maintain the performance for. He describes conversations in cars and in corridors, and during the quiet periods of overseas tours when the scheduled program had ended, and what remained was two people in an unfamiliar city with nothing required of either of them for the next several hours. What Diana said in those conversations was not always the content of a formal record or a media briefing. It was the content of a person describing her life to someone she trusted, because she had run out of people she could trust in the environment she was in. Wharfe's account of what she told him across those 6 years is the account of someone who understood, from proximity rather than analysis, the specific condition Diana was in during the period of the marriage's deterioration and its eventual public collapse. He understood it because she described it to him, and because he was present for enough of it that the description was confirmed by what he observed. The institution's understanding of protection officer relationships is organized around the principle that the professional relationship is the boundary. The officer is there to protect the principal. The officer's personal relationship with the principal is incidental to that function and should be managed to remain incidental rather than developing into the kind of sustained personal engagement that produces the mutual understanding Wharfe describes. The management of that boundary is part of the formal expectation of the role. Officers who find the boundary eroding are expected, in the institutional understanding, to re-establish it through the mechanisms of professional distance. The mechanisms of professional distance are more effective when the principal cooperates with their application, when the principal is actively crossing the professional boundary, when the principal is choosing to treat the protection officer as the most reliable human relationship available to her. In an environment where human relationships have become unreliable, the mechanisms are considerably less effective. They require the officer to maintain distance from someone who is moving toward rather than away from closeness, and the maintenance of that distance requires a form of personal coldness that the protection role's human requirements make difficult to sustain. The officers who served Diana across the years of her marriage were not cold people, by the accounts of those who served alongside them, and by the accounts of the officers themselves who have spoken publicly. They were people who had been selected for qualities that included, alongside physical competence and operational awareness, the interpersonal capacity to manage sustained proximity to a principal, with the steady professionalism the role required. The interpersonal capacity was the quality that made them good at the work. It was also the quality that made them susceptible to the specific dynamic Diana created with the people she chose to trust. She was skilled at the specific human operation of making a person feel they were the only one who genuinely understood her situation. This is not a criticism. It is a description of a person who had been managed and packaged and presented for public consumption across years of marriage, and who had developed, in response to the management, a finely calibrated sense of which people in her environment were performing their relationship with her and which were capable of something more genuine. The calibration produced, across the years, a small number of relationships inside the palace environment that Diana treated as real, and the protection officers, who found themselves inside that small number, found the position significant in ways that the professional boundary was not designed to manage. What they knew, as a result of being inside that small number, exceeded what the institutional framework of the protection relationship anticipated. They knew the internal reality of a royal marriage that was presenting one version of itself to the public and containing, in its private hours, something considerably different. They knew the specific texture of Diana's fear during the period when she later told Andrew Morton she believed she was being surveilled by the institution, that her telephone calls were being listened to, and her movements tracked beyond the requirements of legitimate protection. They knew the names she mentioned and the relationships she was sustaining outside the marriage, and the specific nature of her emotional state, across a period that the public record of the time presented as a fairy tale in the process of its natural maturation. The knowledge was not recorded anywhere, except in the memories of the people who had accumulated it. That is the specific quality of protection officer knowledge that distinguishes it from the other categories of private royal knowledge that the institution manages against. Correspondence can be recovered, and letters can be shredded. Diaries can be secured, and access to documents can be controlled. Memory cannot be filed, and cannot be classified, and cannot be retrieved and destroyed in the way that documentary evidence can be managed. The institution's response to the knowledge that exists in memory is the response available to it, which is the management of the person whose memory contains it. The management can take several forms depending on the specific circumstances of the case and the specific nature of the knowledge involved. It can take the form of transfer, removing the person from the situation in which the knowledge is continuing to accumulate. It can take the form of legal constraint through the non-disclosure agreements and official secrets obligations that royal household and protection staff operate under. It can take the form of reputational management through the institutional communications apparatus that the palace maintains for managing the coverage of people it finds inconvenient. It can take the form of prosecution in cases where the person's public conduct provides a legal basis for proceeding against them. What it cannot take, in any of these forms, is the form of erasing what the person knows. The management is always the management of reach rather than of knowledge. It does not remove the knowledge from the person who holds it. It attempts to prevent the knowledge from moving from the person who holds it into the public record in a form that can be examined. The attempt is what the cases in the following parts of this account document. Each case is specific. Each involves a different person and a different form of institutional management, and a different outcome in terms of what the person was ultimately able to say and in what context they were able to say it. The pattern across the cases is what the individual cases do not fully illuminate in isolation. The pattern is an institution responding consistently to a consistent type of problem across a period of approximately 20 years and across a series of individuals whose specific circumstances differed, but whose relationship to the knowledge they held was the same. They were people who had stood too close for too long and who therefore knew things that the institution's management of Diana's public image required not to be widely known. What they knew, taken together across the cases, forms a picture of Diana's private experience that the official accounts of the period have never fully contained, and that the institution's management of their testimonies was specifically designed to prevent from forming into a coherent public account. The management was partially successful. Several of the officers most directly involved in the most sensitive aspects of Diana's protection arrangements have not spoken publicly in any form that places their full knowledge in the record. The obligations they operate under, the official secrets provisions, and the non-disclosure agreements, and the ongoing requirements of their professional positions have produced a silence that the institution manages as a matter of routine rather than requiring active intervention in each individual case. The partial success is the institution's achievement. The incompleteness of the success is what the cases in this account describe. The incompleteness comes from the cases where the management did not fully work, where the knowledge found pathways into the public record that the institutional management was not equipped to close before the knowledge passed through them. It comes from the accounts that were published before the institution's response was fully mobilized. It comes from the legal proceedings that placed testimony into the record in a form that the institution could not control because the proceedings were adversarial, and the adversarial process produced disclosures that cooperative institutional management would have prevented. It comes, most significantly, from Diana herself. She understood what the institution was doing with the people who came close to her. She had watched it happen across multiple cases before she spoke to Morton. She had developed, from watching it happen, a specific understanding of the institutional response to proximity that informed her own decisions about who she trusted and how she communicated with them. When she sat with Morton's tape recorder in 1991 and described what she believed had happened to Barry Mannakee, she was not speculating about a single incident in isolation. She was describing her understanding of a pattern she had been inside long enough to recognize. The pattern as she understood it was the pattern of an institution that removed people who knew too much, that transferred them and marginalized them, and, in the case she described to Morton, that she believed had arranged something more final. Her understanding was shaped by her emotional relationship with Mannakee and by the specific shock of his death coming so quickly after his transfer. Those factors made her account of the pattern personal in ways that could be attributed, by people who found her account inconvenient, to grief and fear rather than to accurate perception. The attribution was the institutional response available to an account delivered on private tapes that were not yet public. When the tapes became public, the attribution became the dominant framework in which her words were received. The dominant framework served the institution's interest in preventing her account of the pattern from being examined against the other cases. If her belief about Mannakee was the product of personal grief rather than institutional observation, the belief did not need to be examined alongside the subsequent cases of Ken Wharfe, Trevor Rees-Jones, and Paul Burrell. The cases could remain separate, managed individually through the specific response each required, without the pattern they collectively described becoming the subject of examination. The examination that this account conducts requires holding the cases together rather than separately. It requires reading Diana's account of the pattern alongside the specific institutional responses to the specific cases, and asking whether the responses are consistent with what Diana described, and whether the consistency of the responses across the cases is evidence of the pattern she identified. The evidence is the evidence that the public record contains. The public record does not contain everything relevant to answering the question. The institution's management of the people who hold the most relevant knowledge has produced gaps in the public record that are, in some respects, the most significant evidence available, because the gaps exist where the knowledge of the closest witnesses should be, and their existence suggests that the management of those witnesses' reach has been effective. Effective enough to produce the gaps, not effective enough to prevent the cases from being examined together, in the form that the following parts of this account provide. The protection officers stood at the intersection of Diana's private experience and the institution's management of her public life. They saw both simultaneously. The institution managed their ability to describe what they saw with the specific tools available for managing that kind of knowledge in people, in that kind of position. What the tools could not manage was the accumulation of partial disclosures, legal records, published accounts, and documented official responses that together constitute the public record of what the officers experienced and what the institution did when it decided their knowledge had become a risk. The risk was not the risk of dramatic exposure in any single definitive disclosure. It was the risk of accumulated knowledge finding its way into the public record across multiple points of partial disclosure, assembling over time into an account more coherent than any individual disclosure would have produced. The institution managed against the accumulation rather than against any individual disclosure. The management was partly successful and partly not, in the specific proportions that this account's remaining parts describe across the individual cases. The cases begin with the one Diana described on the Morton tapes, the case that formed her understanding of the pattern, and that she believed represented its most extreme expression. Barry Mannakee was 20 years old when Diana married Charles in 1981. He joined the Metropolitan Police and eventually transferred to the Royal Protection Group, where his assignment to Diana's detail placed him in the position of sustained proximity that the protection role requires. He was there across the years when the marriage was deteriorating in ways that the public record of the time was not yet showing. What he saw in those years is not in the public record in any form that he provided directly. He did not publish an account. He did not give interviews. He died on the 5th of May 1987, 6 weeks after he was removed from Diana's protection detail, in a motorcycle accident on the A118 in East London. Diana's recorded account of what she believed about his death is the starting point for the pattern's examination. The examination begins there. Barry Mannakee joined Diana's protection detail in approximately 1985, at a point in the Wales marriage when the gap between the public presentation and the private reality had been widening for long enough that the people inside the household could no longer maintain the fiction of its non-existence among themselves. He was a Metropolitan Police officer, 37 years old, assigned to the Royal Protection Group through the standard operational process that placed officers with the personal protection teams of senior royals. His assignment to Diana's detail was not exceptional in its origin. What developed from it was. The accounts of what happened between Barry Mannakee and Diana across the period of his assignment exist in a specific and limited form in the public record. They exist primarily through Diana's own voice, recorded on the tapes she made for Andrew Morton in 1991, 6 years after Mannakee joined her detail, and 4 years after his death. The tapes were made in secret, in sessions conducted at Kensington Palace while Diana was alone, her words recorded on a cassette that was then passed outside the palace, through a method designed to prevent the institution from knowing they existed. The tapes themselves were therefore the product of the specific conditions that the institution's management of Diana's access to public communication had created. She was recording them in secret because there was no legitimate channel through which she could say what the tapes contained. What they contained, in relation to Barry Mannakee, was direct and specific in a way that Diana's public statements about her marriage had never been. She said she had been deeply in love with him. She used that phrase, or language close to it, in describing what the relationship had meant to her during the period of its existence. She described a closeness that had developed from the sustained proximity of the protection arrangement, from the hours of presence that the protection role required, and from her specific emotional situation during the period when Mannakee was assigned to her. The marriage to Charles was, by the mid-1980s, a household in which two people were maintaining the architecture of a royal marriage without the interior that the architecture was supposed to contain. Diana was isolated in the specific way that people inside institutions become isolated when the institution's management of their public life leaves them without the private human relationships that ordinary life provides. Mannakee was present. That was his professional function. The professional function of presence sustained across months of protection work, produced something that neither professional training nor institutional boundary management had been organized to prevent. The palace became aware of the relationship's character before Diana's protection arrangements were formally changed. The awareness arrived through the channels that palace management of its principals' private lives always uses, through the observation of the people around the principal, through the information that reaches the senior officials responsible for managing the protection arrangements from the officers working within those arrangements. Protection teams are hierarchical, and the hierarchy creates upward flows of information about the principal's behavior and the team's operational environment that the senior officials use to manage both. When the information flowing upward described a protection officer's relationship with the principal in terms that exceeded the professional boundary, the information reached people with the authority to act on it. The action taken was transfer. In the spring of 1987, Barry Mannakee was removed from Diana's protection detail and reassigned to another posting within the Metropolitan Police's operational structure. The removal was handled in the institutional vocabulary that personnel transfers use, the language of career development and operational requirements, and the routine rotation of staff across assignments that prevents any single protection relationship from becoming too entrenched. The vocabulary was accurate in its formal description of what a transfer is. It was not accurate as a description of why this particular transfer happened at this particular time. Diana knew why it had happened. She had been told, or had understood from the circumstances, that the transfer was the institution's response to what it had identified about her relationship with Mannakee. She experienced the removal as a specific institutional act, organized against a relationship that the institution had decided was outside the acceptable parameters of a protection officer's conduct with his principal. The experience of that removal, coming in the context of a marriage she was already experiencing as an institutional management operation, conducted against her interests rather than in service of them, added to the accumulation of specific events that were building in her across those years into the sustained crisis that the Morton tapes document. The transfer happened. Mannakee went to a new assignment. Diana continued in her protection arrangements with different officers. The institutional management of the situation had produced the outcome the institution required, which was the removal of the relationship from the operational environment of the protection detail. 6 weeks after the transfer, on the 5th of May 1987, Barry Mannakee died. He died in a motorcycle accident on the A118 road in the Romford area of East London. He was a passenger on a motorcycle, ridden by a fellow Metropolitan Police officer, Police Constable Stephen Peat. A car driven by a 17-year-old named Nicola Taylor pulled out of a side road and into the path of the motorcycle. The collision was the kind of road accident that happens thousands of times each year in Britain, the product of a driver's failure to observe an approaching vehicle at a road junction, with consequences that in this case were fatal for one of the motorcycle's occupants. The Metropolitan Police investigated the accident through the standard procedures applied to any road fatality involving a police officer. Nicola Taylor was subsequently convicted of careless driving. The investigation produced no findings of any cause other than the road accident itself. No evidence was found of criminal intent in the circumstances of the collision. The official record of Barry Mannakee's death is the record of an accident, adjudicated through the appropriate legal process, with the appropriate party held accountable for the driving failure that produced it. Diana learned of his death in circumstances that she described on the Morton tapes, in terms that suggest the manner of the telling remained as significant to her as the news itself. She was in a car with Charles, traveling to the Cannes Film Festival, when he told her what had happened. She described Charles delivering the news in a way she characterized as relatively matter-of-fact, the communication of information rather than the expression of shared grief for someone both of them had known. She was required to continue to the film festival and to perform the public role that the engagement required. In the hours immediately following learning that a person she had described as deeply important to her was dead. The specific quality of that requirement, to absorb the news of Mannakee's death and then to step out of a car at Cannes and perform the Princess of Wales role for cameras, is the kind of detail that the Morton tapes preserve, in a form that official accounts of Diana's life do not. The official accounts are organized around the public events and their management. The tapes are organized around Diana's private experience of being inside those events, while carrying what she was carrying privately, and the gap between the two is the gap that the tapes document with a consistency and a specificity that no other source about Diana's inner life provides. On the tapes, she said she thought Mannakee had been bumped off. She used those words, or words close to them, in the context of describing her belief about his death. She was not presenting it as a conclusion she had reached through investigation or through access to evidence that contradicted the official account. She was describing what she believed, and the belief was organized around the timing of the accident relative to his transfer, around the specific swiftness of the institutional response to the relationship she had formed with him, and around her broader understanding of how the institution managed the people who came too close to her private life. The belief has been examined in a number of subsequent accounts, including by the official investigation into Diana's death, Operation Paget, which was conducted by Lord Stevens between 2004 and 2006. Operation Paget examined the Mannakee case as part of its broader investigation into the claims and counterclaims that surrounded Diana's death and the circumstances preceding it. Its findings in relation to Mannakee were that there was no evidence of deliberate harm in the road accident, that the circumstances of the accident were consistent with the official account of a road collision caused by the driver of the other vehicle, and that the conviction of Nicola Taylor for careless driving represented the appropriate legal conclusion to the matter. The findings are the findings of a thorough official investigation conducted by a senior and respected police officer. They constitute the most authoritative examination of the specific question Diana raised on the Morton tapes, and they do not support her belief that his death was deliberate. What they do not address, because it is a different question from the one the investigation was examining, is the institutional management of Mannakee's transfer and what the transfer represented about how the palace managed the specific problem of a protection officer who had developed a personal relationship with his principal that exceeded the professional boundary. The transfer is the institutional fact that the official investigation's examination of the accident's circumstances does not illuminate. The transfer tells something about the institution's response to the knowledge that Mannakee had accumulated during his time on Diana's detail, about the specific concern that his closeness to her generated in the people responsible for managing her protection arrangements, and about the mechanism the institution used to manage the situation. Transfer is the most straightforward of the institutional management tools available in this context. It removes the person from the immediate situation without requiring the confrontation that dismissal would produce. It creates physical distance between the person and the source of the accumulated knowledge. It places the person within a different operational environment where the specific knowledge they carry is less immediately relevant and less easily communicated to the people who might find it significant. The transfer of Mannakee was accomplished with the speed that institutional decisions of that kind are accomplished when the people making the decision have concluded that the situation requires immediate resolution. He was moved. He was no longer part of Diana's operational environment. The knowledge he had accumulated across his time on her detail was in his memory and remained there, but the operational context in which that knowledge might have found expression, in the day-to-day presence beside a principal who was speaking to him and trusting him and continuing to develop the relationship that the institution had decided was problematic, was removed. Diana's response to the transfer was the response documented on the tapes: grief, anger, and the specific interpretation of the institution's action that she developed from the experience of watching it happen. The interpretation was shaped by her emotional investment in the relationship and by the specific timing of Mannakee's death relative to his removal. Those two factors, the emotion and the timing, produced in her a reading of events that the official investigation subsequently found no evidence to support as an account of what had actually occurred. The emotional and timing-based quality of her interpretation has been used, consistently, in the coverage of the Mannakee case, to position her belief as a product of grief rather than of institutional observation. The positioning is not without basis. Diana was grieving someone she had cared for, and grief can produce interpretations of events that attach causal significance to temporal coincidence. The 6 weeks between the transfer and the accident is a period short enough to be striking and long enough that it cannot, on its own, constitute evidence of a connection. The positioning as grief rather than observation serves a specific interest, however. It separates Diana's belief about Mannakee from her broader account of the institution's management of the people close to her, treating it as an isolated emotional reaction rather than as one case in a pattern she had observed across multiple instances. If the Mannakee belief is grief, it stands alone. If it is the specific case that formed her understanding of the institutional pattern she subsequently described across other contexts, its relationship to the other cases becomes relevant in ways that the grief framing forecloses. Diana's description of the institution's behavior on the Morton tapes is not organized exclusively around the Mannakee case. The tapes describe a sustained period during which she believed she was being surveilled by the institution, that her conversations were being monitored and her movements tracked beyond the requirements of legitimate security. They describe her experience of the institution as something that managed against her rather than for her, that deployed the resources of the protection arrangements and the palace communications operations in directions that served the institution's interests rather than her own. The Mannakee case is the most dramatic instance of the pattern she was describing, but it exists within a broader account of how the institution treated the people and the relationships that it identified as outside its preferred management of her public life. The broader account was not taken seriously in the public domain during Diana's lifetime because the institutional management of her public presentation was sufficiently effective that the gap between the managed version and the private reality was not visible to the public in the terms that the Morton tapes eventually made available. The tapes were made in 1991. They were not publicly released until after Diana's death, when Morton published the original recordings alongside the book's revised edition in 1997. The years between the recording and the publication were years in which the institutional management of Diana's public presentation continued, and the private reality the tapes documented continued to be managed against public visibility. When the tapes were released, the Mannakee material was among the most significant content in terms of the picture it painted of Diana's private experience and her relationship with the institution. It was also the content most susceptible to the grief framing that the institutional management apparatus deployed against it, because the specific nature of her belief about his death gave the coverage a focus that the grief framing could contain more effectively than the broader institutional critique the tapes presented. The family of Barry Mannakee has never accepted the grief framing as a satisfactory account of how the Mannakee case should be understood. His son, Paul Mannakee, has spoken in documentary and press contexts across the years since Diana's death about the family's experience of the period following his father's removal from Diana's detail and his subsequent death. The family's account of the transfer's effect on Barry Mannakee is an account of a person who was affected by the removal in ways that exceeded what a routine career reassignment would produce, who carried the weight of what had happened in ways that his family observed and that were visible to them as something more than professional disappointment. Paul Mannakee's public statements have described his father as someone who had formed a genuine emotional connection with Diana during his time on her detail, and who experienced his removal from that detail as a significant personal loss as well as a professional one. The family's account of Barry Mannakee's emotional state in the 6 weeks between his transfer and his death is not the account of a man in the ordinary conditions of a career transition. It is the account of a man dealing with the abrupt removal of a relationship that had mattered to him, in circumstances he understood as the institutional management of that relationship's unacceptability. The family's account does not constitute evidence of anything other than what a family observed about a person they knew well. It does not support Diana's specific belief about the deliberate nature of his death, and the family has not publicly endorsed that belief in those specific terms. What the family's account does is complicate the institutional narrative of the transfer as a routine personnel decision with no significant human cost to the person transferred, by providing a witness account of what the transfer produced in the person it was applied to. The witness account is the kind of evidence that institutional management is least equipped to contain, because it lives in the memory of people who were adjacent to the events and who were not subject to the official secrets obligations and non-disclosure agreements that management of the people directly inside the institution can apply. Barry Mannakee's family was not inside the Royal Protection Group. They were not bound by the operational secrecy provisions that govern the communications of officers within it. They observed what the transfer produced in a person they knew, and they have described what they observed. What they described is a person who was transferred for reasons the official vocabulary of career management described in institutional terms that did not reflect the human reality of what the transfer represented. The gap between the official vocabulary and the human reality is where the institution's management of the Mannakee case is most clearly legible to anyone examining it, with attention to both the official record and the adjacent witness accounts that exist alongside it. The official record is the transfer documentation and the accident investigation and the careless driving conviction and Operation Paget's findings. The adjacent witness account is the family's description of Barry Mannakee in the 6 weeks between his transfer and his death, and Diana's account on the Morton tapes of what she believed and what that belief was based on. The two things exist in the permanent record in a relationship that the institutional management of the case has attempted to present as simply explained. The official investigation found no evidence of deliberate harm. Diana's belief was a product of personal grief. The case is closed. The relationship between the two things is more complicated than the simply explained version allows, because the official investigation examined the circumstances of the accident and not the circumstances of the transfer, and the transfer is where the institutional response to the accumulated knowledge of proximity is most clearly documented. The transfer tells what the institution did when it identified a protection officer whose relationship with its principal had exceeded the professional boundary. It tells the speed with which the institution acted when it made that determination. It tells the specific form of management it chose, which was physical removal from the operational environment, rather than any form of engagement with the relationship or the circumstances that had produced it. What it does not tell, because transfers in institutional records do not typically contain this information, is what the institution understood about the specific content of what Mannakee knew about Diana, about the specific things she had said to him, and the specific aspects of her private life that had become visible to him across his time on her detail. The transfer tells that the institution found his proximity to Diana unacceptable. It does not specify which elements of what his proximity had produced were driving the finding of unacceptability. Diana's account on the Morton tapes, recorded 4 years after his death, suggests her understanding of what those elements were. Her account describes a relationship of genuine emotional depth, a connection that had developed from the protection work's sustained proximity into something that both people involved had experienced as significantly more than professional. If her account is accurate, then Mannakee's knowledge of her was not only the knowledge of a protection officer who had observed her physical environment and her security risks. It was the knowledge of someone she had been emotionally present with, in a way that she had been emotionally present with very few people in her life inside the palace. That kind of knowledge is specific to the person who holds it. It cannot be transferred or recovered or managed in the way that documentary evidence can be managed. The institution transferred Barry Mannakee, and he was dead 6 weeks later, and the knowledge he had accumulated across his time on Diana's detail went with him, into a silence that the accident made permanent, in a way that the transfer alone might not have achieved. Diana believed those two things were connected. The official investigation found no evidence to support the connection. The family describes a person whose experience of the transfer was not the experience of a routine career reassignment. All three of those things are true simultaneously. The permanent record contains all three. The institutional management of the case has been organized around the first of them, which is the official investigation's finding, as though the finding's existence resolved the questions that the other two things raise. The finding resolves the specific question it was designed to answer, which is whether the accident was deliberate. It does not resolve the question of what the institution's management of Mannakee's proximity to Diana tells about the institution's response to that kind of proximity. That question belongs to the pattern rather than to the individual case. It belongs to the examination of what the institution consistently did when it identified someone who had accumulated too much knowledge of Diana's private experience, and it requires the other cases alongside it to be visible in the terms that Diana recognized when she described what she believed had happened to the man she had been in love with. The pattern begins with Mannakee because Diana understood it as beginning there. Whether she was accurate in her most extreme claim about that beginning is the question the official investigation examined and found against. Whether the beginning she identified was the beginning of the pattern she then watched repeat across other cases is a question the subsequent parts of this account address by examining what happened to the other people who stood too close and knew too much. Ken Wharfe stood beside Diana for 6 years after Mannakee's death. He accumulated across those 6 years a body of knowledge about her private life and her relationship with the institution that made his eventual book, published in 2002, one of the most specific and authoritative accounts of her private experience available in the public record. The institution's response to Wharfe's knowledge was different in form from its response to Mannakee's, because the circumstances were different and the specific nature of the threat the knowledge represented was different. The difference in form does not mean the difference in the underlying institutional response. The underlying response was the same. Someone who had stood close enough to Diana to know things the institution preferred not to have known was managed in the direction of silence. How that management operated in Wharfe's case, across the years between his service on Diana's detail and his eventual book's publication, belongs to the following part of this account. What the Mannakee case establishes, before moving to Wharfe, is the starting point for Diana's understanding of the pattern. She believed the institution had removed a man she cared for, and then, 6 weeks later, that man was dead. The belief shaped everything she subsequently understood about what the institution did with people who knew too much. The belief was formed in grief and in the specific emotional context of a woman who had been denied the relationship that she had found meaningful, and it was formed by watching the timing of events that produced in her a reading of causation that the official investigation did not substantiate. Whether the reading was accurate is not fully settled by the official investigation's finding, because the official investigation's finding addressed the accident and not the broader question of how the institution manages the knowledge accumulated by the people it removes from proximity to its principles. The broader question is what the following cases illuminate. They illuminate it from the experiences of people who survived long enough to speak, in varying degrees of constraint and freedom, about what their proximity to Diana had shown them and what the institution had done in response to their knowing it. Barry Mannakee did not survive to speak. That is the fact at the center of the Mannakee case that no official finding and no grief framing fully resolves, because the person whose account would have been most relevant to the questions the case raises is the person whose account is permanently unavailable. The permanence of that unavailability is what Diana described as the institution's most effective management of the specific knowledge he had carried. She was 25 years old when she formed that understanding. She carried it for the remaining 10 years of her life. Ken Wharfe arrived on Diana's protection detail in 1987, the same year Barry Mannakee was removed from it. The timing was not coincidental in the sense of being arranged, but it was consequential in the sense that Diana was in a specific state of mind when Wharfe began his assignment, shaped by the removal and subsequent death of the officer who had preceded him. She was, by multiple accounts of the period, more withdrawn from the protection team in the immediate aftermath of Mannakee's death than she had been before it. The specific withdrawal of someone who had learned that the consequences of closeness with the people in her immediate professional environment could exceed what she had calculated when she allowed the closeness to develop. The withdrawal did not last in the permanent way that withdrawal sometimes becomes a person's permanent condition after a significant loss. Diana was not built for permanent withdrawal. She was built for engagement, for the specific human connection that the institutional environment around her consistently failed to provide through its formal channels, and that she consistently sought through the informal channels available to her. Wharfe was assigned to her in the period of the withdrawal, and the recovery from that withdrawal across the months of his early assignment produced, through the same mechanisms of sustained proximity that had produced the Mannakee relationship, a different, but equally significant form of closeness. Different in character, because the specific emotional quality of what Diana had experienced with Mannakee was not something she attempted to replicate in the same form with Wharfe. What developed instead was the kind of relationship that people who worked together across years of close quarters develop when one of them treats the professional relationship as the primary human relationship available to them in their circumstances. Diana talked to Wharfe in the specific way that isolated people talk to the reliable witnesses they cannot escape. She talked to him because he was there, because he had been there consistently across years, in which the other constants of her life were proving unreliable, and because the quality of his attention to her environment, the professional watchfulness that his role required, had a quality she found easier to trust than the institutional attention of the people whose job it was to manage her, rather than to protect her. He served as her principal protection officer for 6 years, from 1987 to 1993. 6 years is a long time to stand beside a person. It is long enough to see them across the range of conditions that a human life produces, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones, the days when the performance is working and the days when it is not, the days when the person inside the role is visible through the role, and the days when the role has fully absorbed the person. Wharfe saw Diana across all of those conditions. He was present across the period of the marriage's final deterioration, across the publication of Andrew Morton's book in 1992, across the separation announcement in December of that year, and through the years of the post-separation period in which Diana was navigating her position as a separated princess whose public popularity had become a specific problem for the institution that was simultaneously managing her departure from the central working royal structure. What he accumulated across those 6 years was not a single significant secret or a single explosive revelation. It was the accumulated texture of a person's private life, observed across a sustained period from a position of professional proximity that gave him access to the unmanaged hours and the unscripted conversations and the specific moments that the palace communications apparatus was not present for. The texture is what the institutional record of a person's life does not contain, because the institutional record is organized around the events that the institution managed and approved and communicated through its official channels. The texture is what exists in the gaps between those events, in the hours that the official schedule does not cover, and the conversations that the official communications do not describe. Wharfe's knowledge of Diana's texture was specific and detailed and organized across years of direct observation. It was the kind of knowledge that a good protection officer inevitably accumulates, because the protection role's requirements produce it as a necessary condition of performing the role effectively. You cannot protect a person without understanding them. You cannot understand them without observing them across conditions that the institutional performance does not include. The observation produces knowledge that the institution did not intend to share with the person doing the observing, but that the role's requirements make impossible to prevent. The institution understood this about the protection role as a general matter and managed it through the specific obligations it placed on officers within the Royal Protection Group. The obligations were of 2 primary kinds. The first was the standard official secrets provision that applies to all police officers working in sensitive government roles, the legal obligation to maintain confidentiality about information obtained in the course of official duties that is not in the public domain. The second was the specific contractual and professional obligations that the Royal Protection Group's working arrangements placed on its officers in relation to the royal family members they protected, obligations that went beyond the standard police confidentiality provision and that were specifically designed to prevent the publication of accounts drawn from protection work with the royals. These obligations were real and legally enforceable, and the institution deployed them consistently in managing the communications of people who left the protection arrangements with knowledge it preferred to keep contained. The deployment was not aggressive in the sense of involving active legal threats in each individual case. It was the deployment of the known legal framework, the awareness among officers that the obligations existed, and that publishing without clearance would produce institutional and legal consequences, which produced a self-governing silence among the majority of officers who served in the royal protection arrangements without any individual institutional intervention being required in each case. The majority of officers maintained that silence permanently. They left the protection arrangements, returned to other policing careers or retired, and carried what they had accumulated across their service in the specific silence that the legal and professional obligations produced and that institutional loyalty reinforced. The majority is the management apparatus's most reliable product. the people who never test the obligations because the obligations have become part of their understanding of what is expected of them and who they are professionally. Wharfe was not the majority. He left Diana's protection detail in 1993, in circumstances that have been described differently in different accounts, and that illustrate, in their contested nature, the specific quality of institutional management that the palace applies to the departures of people whose service with its principles has been significant. The institutional account of his departure is the account of a routine transition, the natural end of a protection assignment that had run its course, and whose conclusion was managed in the normal way that such transitions are managed. The account Wharfe has given, across the interviews and the public statements he made after Diana's death, is more specific about the conditions under which the transition occurred, describing a period of increasing tension between his operational assessments and the institutional preferences of the people managing Diana's protection arrangements, and a departure that was shaped by those tensions rather than by the ordinary operational calculus of assignment rotation. Diana's own perspective on Wharfe's departure from her detail is documented in accounts from the period and from the subsequent reporting by journalists who covered her closely in the years between the separation and her death. The accounts describe a principal who had mixed feelings about the transition, who had found Wharfe's sustained presence across 6 years to be a specific form of professional security, even in the periods when the relationship's specific dynamics were producing friction, and who was aware that his departure removed from her immediate environment a person with detailed knowledge of her private life and private fears. The friction in the relationship was real and is documented in Wharfe's own account. 6 years of close protection produces friction as inevitably as it produces closeness, because the professional boundary whose maintenance the institution requires is not always consistent with the operational realities of the protection work, and the tensions between what the professional boundary demands and what the operational reality requires produce, across sustained periods, moments of conflict between the protection officer's professional judgment and the principal's personal preferences. Diana had strong preferences about how her protection was managed, shaped by her specific experience of the protection arrangements as simultaneously a professional service and a form of institutional surveillance. She understood, from years of living inside the protection arrangements, that the protection officers were the people whose presence gave the institution the most direct visibility into her private movements and her private life. She managed her relationship with the protection team with that understanding present, seeking to develop the specific individual relationships that gave her a degree of control over the information flowing from the team to the institution, while maintaining the professional arrangement that her security required. Wharfe was the most senior officer on her detail across those 6 years, which meant he was the person with the most institutional accountability for what the team communicated upward about Diana's activities and movements. The tension between his institutional accountability and Diana's specific management of her relationship with the team was a sustained feature of the working arrangement across the later years of his assignment, and it is the tension that most of the accounts of his departure identify as its primary context. After his departure from Diana's detail, Wharfe returned to other policing work within the Metropolitan Police structure. He retired eventually, in the normal way of a police officer who has completed a career. He did not immediately publish anything about his time on Diana's detail. The years between his departure in 1993 and Diana's death in 1997 were years in which the obligations he had undertaken as a serving officer and the professional loyalty that those obligations both required and reinforced prevented any public account of his service with Diana from appearing. Diana died in August 1997. Her death changed the situation for many of the people who had been inside her protection arrangements, not because the legal obligations they were subject to changed in their formal terms, because they did not, but because the context in which those obligations operated changed in a way that made the calculation about speaking significantly different from what it had been while she was alive. The calculation while she was alive was organized around the protection of a living person's privacy and the maintenance of a professional relationship that was ongoing in its institutional dimensions even after the individual protection assignment had ended. The institution retained the ability to affect former officers' professional interests and their relationships with the Metropolitan Police and the Royal Protection Group in ways that gave the silence a concrete professional incentive alongside its legal and ethical basis. After Diana's death, the calculation changed because several of the factors that had given the silence its concrete incentive were altered by the death itself. The person whose privacy was at stake was no longer alive. The professional relationships with the institution that had provided the incentive for silence remained, but they were now in a context where the institutional interest in the silence was organized around the management of Diana's posthumous reputation and the institution's own relationship to the events of her life, rather than around the ongoing management of a living principal's public presentation. The changed context produced a different calculation for some of the people who had been inside the protection arrangements, and the different calculation produced, across the years following Diana's death, a series of accounts from people who had been close to her that the institutional management apparatus received as a new category of management challenge. Wharfe's book, Diana, Closely Guarded Secret, was published in 2002, 5 years after Diana's death and 9 years after he had left her protection detail. The 5 years between the death and the publication reflect something about the pace at which the calculation about speaking shifts in the specific circumstances of a former protection officer's relationship to the obligations they carry. They are years in which the decision about whether to speak and how much to say and in what form to say it is worked through against the background of the obligation's continued legal existence and the institution's continued interest in the management of Diana's posthumous narrative. The book was submitted through the process that former royal household and protection staff use when they are publishing accounts of their service, a process organized around the review of the manuscript by appropriate authorities before publication to ensure that the material does not breach the official secrets provisions or the specific contractual obligations of the royal protection arrangements. The review process is the institution's management tool for the category of former staff who decide to publish rather than maintain permanent silence, a tool that allows the institution to identify and, if necessary, seek to prevent the publication of material it believes breaches the obligations, while permitting the publication of material it determines falls within acceptable limits. Wharfe's manuscript went through this review process. The book that appeared in 2002 was the book that emerged from that process, which means it was the account that the institution had determined fell within the boundaries of what the obligations permitted, rather than the full account of what Wharfe's 6 years on Diana's detail had produced in terms of knowledge and observation. The gap between those two things is not fully visible from the outside, because the review process does not produce a public record of what was removed or modified in the course of the review. What is visible is the book that appeared, which is itself a specific and detailed account of Diana's private life across the years of Wharfe's service, and the observation that the book that appeared is the book that the review process permitted, rather than the book that Wharfe's unfiltered knowledge of those years might have produced. The book that appeared contains accounts of Diana's behavior and her private life that the institution found uncomfortable in their specificity, because the institutional preference for the posthumous management of Diana's narrative was organized around the preservation of the public version of her life, rather than the provision of additional private detail from the people who had been closest to her. Wharfe's book, even in its reviewed and cleared form, provided more specific private detail than the institutional preference for her posthumous management favored. The institutional response to the book's publication was the response the palace communications apparatus applies to publications by former staff that it finds uncomfortable but cannot prevent, which is the management of the coverage through the channels available to the institution. The coverage of Wharfe's book in the British press was shaped by the institutional communications apparatus's management in the specific way that royal coverage is always shaped by that management, through the briefing network's communication of the institution's view of the publication to the royal correspondents who cover the palace and who have professional interests in maintaining their access relationships with it. The institutional view was communicated in the register of disappointment and breach of trust that the palace deploys when former staff publish accounts it finds inconvenient. The register communicated, without formal statement in most cases, that the book was regarded by people close to the institution as a breach of the professional loyalty that the protection role requires, and that its author had chosen public disclosure over the discretion that his years of privileged access to the royal family had been provided on the understanding of its maintenance. The register shaped some of the coverage of the book in a direction unfavorable to Wharfe's credibility as a source, without the institution needing to make any formal challenge to the book's content that would have required engaging with the specifics of what the book contained.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
The management was partially effective in the domestic British press environment, where the briefing network's relationships produced coverage that reflected the institutional disappointment register alongside the coverage of the book's actual content. It was less effective in the international press environment, where the book was received primarily as a significant account of Diana's private life from someone who had been inside it, without the interpretive layer of institutional disappointment that the domestic briefing network provided. Wharfe has continued to speak about Diana across the years since the book's publication, in documentary appearances and interview contexts, and in the ongoing public conversation about Diana's life and death that the 25 years since August 1997 have produced. His public statements across this period have a specific quality that reflects the continued presence of the obligations he operates under, alongside the decision he made in 2002 to enter the public record with an account of his service. The quality is the quality of someone who has calculated, across many public appearances and many questions from interviewers, the boundary between what he can say within the obligation's requirements and what lies outside those requirements, and who is navigating that boundary in real time as each interview or public appearance unfolds. The navigation produces a specific texture in his public statements, a texture of someone who is providing genuine information within a constrained space, rather than providing the full account that the full extent of his knowledge would produce. The constrained space is itself evidence of the institutional management of his knowledge, because the constraint is not his own preference for selectivity, but the legal and professional obligation structure within which the selectivity is required. When he says something and then qualifies it, or provides context that is general where the specific would be more informative, or describes Diana's state of mind in terms that are illustrative rather than directly quotative, the qualification and the generality and the illustration are the product of a person operating within the constraint rather than a person choosing to be imprecise. What Wharfe has said publicly, across the book and the subsequent interviews and documentary appearances, is specific enough to constitute a significant body of evidence about Diana's private experience across the years of her marriage's deterioration and its aftermath. He has described the specific quality of her fear during periods when she believed the institution was managing against her rather than for her. He has described her relationship with the protection team in terms that confirm the picture of a woman who sought genuine human connection in the institutional environment through the professional relationships that were most consistently present in her daily life. He has described the specific texture of the marriage's reality in the years he was observing it from the position of sustained proximity that the protection role provided. He has described, in terms that are measured but legible to anyone listening carefully, the gap between the official version of Diana's life during those years and the version he observed. The gap is the version the institution managed against, the version that the protection role's proximity produced in the people who occupied it across the years of his service, and that the institutional obligations structure was designed to prevent from reaching the public record in its full form. The institution's management of Wharfe's knowledge was more successful than its management of some of the other cases this account examines, in the specific sense that the full extent of what 6 years of principal protection officer service produced in terms of observed private detail is not in the public record in any form. The review process that cleared his book for publication ensured that the form in which his account reached the public was the form the institution had determined was within the obligation boundaries, rather than the form that his knowledge, unfiltered, would have produced. The gap between the cleared form and the full knowledge is the institution's achievement in this case. The achievement is partial, because the cleared form contains more than the institution preferred to have in public circulation, and because Wharfe's subsequent public appearances have added to the record in ways that the initial clearance process could not fully anticipate. But it is an achievement in the sense that the most sensitive elements of what 6 years of proximity to Diana during the most significant period of her marriage's deterioration produced in a protection officer's direct knowledge are not in the public record in a form that the institution was required to permit. The specific content of what the most sensitive elements might be is not available from the public record because the institution's management of the review process is not public and the gaps in the cleared version are not identifiable from outside the process. What is available is the general shape of what the cleared version contains and the reasonable inference that a 6-year service as principal protection officer to Diana or during the years between 1987 and 1993 produced knowledge of her private life that was more specific than the cleared version provides. The inference is supported by the specific quality of Wharfe's public presentations, which consistently convey the sense of someone who knows more than they are saying and is choosing their words with the awareness of that knowledge's full extent, rather than with the breezy confidence of someone who has said everything relevant they know. The awareness is the product of the obligation structure and the review process and the years of calculation about how to communicate meaningfully within constraints that cannot be publicly acknowledged as constraints. It is also in the specific way that constraints on genuine knowledge produce in people with something real to say, a quality that communicates something about the nature of what the constraints are containing. Diana's death in 1997 ended the direct working relationship between the protection arrangements and the people whose knowledge they had produced, in the specific sense that the operational requirement for that knowledge was terminated by the death of the person the knowledge concerned. It did not end the institution's interest in managing the reach of that knowledge, because the posthumous management of Diana's narrative had become one of the institution's specific communications challenges in the years following her death, organized around the question of how to hold together a coherent public account of her life and her relationship with the institution in the face of the accumulating body of accounts from people who had been close to her. The accumulating body of accounts included Wharfe's book and his subsequent public appearances, and the accounts of others who had been inside Diana's orbit in various capacities, and who had, after her death, made the same calculation about speaking that Wharfe had made, and arrived at the same conclusion in varying degrees of detail and disclosure. The institution managed each account through the tools available to it in each specific case. The tools varied by case. With Wharfe, the primary tool was the review process that cleared the book before publication, operating alongside the briefing network's management of the coverage in the domestic press environment. With other people whose accounts appeared after Diana's death, different tools were available and were applied in ways that the following parts of this account describe. The consistency across the tool's application is the pattern this account is tracing. Different people, different circumstances, different specific forms of institutional management, producing in each case the same directional result, which is the management of knowledge acquired through proximity to Diana in the direction of silence or constraint rather than in the direction of full disclosure. Wharfe's case is the case in which the constraint was most formally managed through the review process and the obligation structure in a way that left a documented institutional footprint in the form of the gap between what a cleared publication contains and what the full knowledge would have produced. The documented footprint is the evidence of the management's operation that the institutional process leaves behind even when the management is successful in its primary objective. The primary objective in Wharfe's case was not to prevent publication entirely, because by 2002, the institutional calculation about preventing publication had shifted in the direction of managed disclosure over prevented disclosure, for the specific reason that the posthumous management of Diana's narrative required the institution to engage with the accounts that were appearing, rather than to suppress them entirely, since total suppression of accounts from people with Wharfe's level of direct knowledge would itself have become a story that complicated the institutional narrative more than the managed accounts did. The shift from suppression to managed disclosure is the institutional management evolution that Diana's death produced in the handling of the protection officer's knowledge. During her lifetime, The primary management tool had been the obligation structure and the professional loyalty it reinforced, producing silence as the default outcome. After her death, silence became less sustainable, as the accounts from people who had been close to her began to appear, and the institution shifted toward the management of disclosure through the review process and the briefing network's shaping of coverage, rather than toward the prevention of disclosure through the obligation structure's enforcement. The shift was a management adaptation, rather than an institutional change in underlying interest. The underlying interest remained the same, which was the management of the knowledge that Diana's proximity to specific individuals had produced in those individuals, in the direction that served the institution's posthumous narrative of her life. The adaptation was in the specific tools deployed to serve that interest, shifting from the prevention tools appropriate while Diana was alive to the management tools appropriate after her death. Ken Wharfe navigated the shift as one of the most significant cases in its operation. He made the decision to enter the public record with an account of his service that the review process permitted. He has continued to operate within the obligation structure in his subsequent public appearances, in the specific navigating quality that his public statements carry. He has provided the public record with more than it would have contained without his decision to speak, and less than it would contain if the obligation structure and the review process had not shaped what he was able to say. The more is the account of Diana's private life across 6 years of principal protection officer service. The less is what the full knowledge of those 6 years would have produced without the institutional management of its public expression. The gap between the more and the less is the institution's management of Ken Wharfe's proximity to Diana, visible in the cleared form of his published account and in the navigating quality of his public presentations, operating as the specific form of management that the institution applies when suppression is no longer available, and managed disclosure is the instrument the circumstances require. After Diana died in Paris in the early hours of the 31st of August 1997, the question of what the people closest to her in the hours before her death had seen and heard and were able to communicate about what had occurred became the specific focus of the management challenge that the following cases address. One person survived the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel with the kind of injuries that the medical staff who treated him described as extraordinarily fortunate in their outcomes, given the conditions of the impact. Trevor Rees-Jones had been Diana's bodyguard on the night of the 31st of August. He had been in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes that carried Diana and Dodi Fayed through the tunnel at a speed that the official investigation subsequently established was substantially above the legal limit. He survived. Diana did not. Dodi Fayed did not. Henri Paul, the driver, did not. Rees-Jones survived with serious facial injuries that required extensive surgical reconstruction and with a gap in his memory of the moments immediately before the impact that he described, in his subsequent account, as the product of the trauma itself rather than of any deliberate act. The gap in the memory of the only surviving witness to what happened inside the car in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel became one of the specific focal points of the subsequent investigation and of the accounts that the investigation produced. It belongs to the following part of this account. Trevor Rees-Jones was 29 years old on the night of the 31st of August 1997. He had been working as a personal protection officer for Mohammed Al-Fayed's security operation for approximately 2 years, having left the parachute regiment where he had served as a soldier before moving into the private security sector. His assignment on that night was the protection of Dodi Fayed, Mohammed Al-Fayed's son, who was in Paris with Diana following a summer spent largely aboard the Al-Fayed family yacht in the Mediterranean. His position in the Mercedes S280 that entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at approximately 12:23 in the morning was the front passenger seat. Henri Paul, the assistant head of security at the Paris Ritz and the driver of the vehicle that night, was to his left. Diana and Dodi Fayed were in the rear seats. Rees-Jones was wearing a seatbelt. The others in the vehicle were not. The impact with the 13th pillar of the tunnel occurred at a speed that the French judicial investigation subsequently established was between 95 and 100 kilometers per hour in a zone with a 50 kilometer per hour limit. The Mercedes struck the pillar on the driver's side, and then the rear of the vehicle struck the tunnel wall. The The forces involved were sufficient to kill 3 of the 4 occupants and to inflict on the 4th the specific category of injuries that emergency medical personnel describe as survivable by a margin that the attending surgeons at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital found extraordinary. Rees-Jones survived with injuries that required him to be placed in a medically induced coma in the hours following the crash. His facial injuries were severe enough to require multiple reconstructive surgical procedures across the weeks of his initial hospitalization. His physical recovery was substantial, sufficient to allow him to return to functional life across the months following the crash, though the reconstruction of his face required sustained medical attention over a period that extended considerably beyond the initial hospitalization. His memory of the moments immediately before the impact was not part of what returned with his physical recovery. The absence of that memory became one of the most examined aspects of the sole survivor's account of what had happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, because the moments immediately before the impact were the moments about which every investigation of the crash most needed the testimony of someone who had been present. The driver was dead. The passengers were dead. Rees-Jones was alive and was the only person who had been in the vehicle and could in principle provide testimony about the conditions inside it in the period before the crash, about Henri Paul's state, about the speed of travel, about what was said and what occurred in the rear of the vehicle in the moments before the impact. The memory was not there. Rees-Jones described its absence in terms consistent with what trauma medicine understands about the specific way that severe head injury can affect the encoding and retrieval of memories from the period immediately surrounding the traumatic event. The medical explanation for the memory gap is real and documented, and the neurological literature on traumatic amnesia supports the existence of the specific phenomenon he described, in which memories from the moments immediately before a severe traumatic impact are not reliably encoded and cannot therefore be reliably retrieved. The medical explanation is the starting point for understanding what Rees-Jones could and could not tell the investigations that examined his account. It is also the starting point for understanding the specific way in which his account became a focal point for the theories and counter-theories that surrounded the investigation of Diana's death, because the absence of memory from the most significant moments was both medically explicable and frustratingly consistent with the silence that the most interested parties in the questions about that night most needed broken. The French judicial investigation, conducted by Judge Hervé Stéphane across the years between the crash and the conclusion of proceedings in 2000, examined Rees-Jones's account through the formal mechanisms of French examining magistrate procedure. The procedure involves repeated formal interviews of witnesses under legal oath, with the examining magistrate directing the questioning in the direction the investigation requires. Rees-Jones was interviewed multiple times across the period of the French investigation, in the formal interview settings that the procedure requires, and with the legal representation appropriate to someone who was simultaneously a witness to the events under investigation and a potential subject of the investigation's inquiry into the driver of the vehicle. The formal interviews produced a record of what Rees-Jones said and was able to say about the events of the night, organized around the question of what he remembered and what the specific limits of his memory were. The record is not fully public in the form that makes individual interview transcripts available for examination, because the French investigating magistrate procedure keeps the investigation's evidence in a form that is not routinely disclosed during the investigation's pendency. The investigation's conclusions and the formal judicial determination that no individual was to be prosecuted in connection with the crash are public. The full evidentiary record underlying those conclusions is held within the French judicial system rather than in the public domain. What Rees-Jones said publicly about his account of that night was shaped by several factors that operated simultaneously across the years following the crash. The first was the French investigation's requirements, which placed him under the obligations of a witness in formal legal proceedings and constrained what he could say publicly about the events under investigation during the period the proceedings were active. The second was his employment relationship with Mohammed Al-Fayed, under whose corporate security operation he had been working when the crash occurred, and whose own investigations and public statements about the crash's causes were a significant feature of the public landscape across the years of the investigation. The third was the book he published in 2000, written with the journalist Moira Johnston, titled The Bodyguard's Story. The book's publication in 2000, 3 years after the crash, and in the period when the French investigation was approaching its conclusion, was managed through the specific commercial and legal process that a memoir of this kind requires, involving the negotiation of publishing rights, the management of the legal sensitivities around the content given the active French proceedings and the likelihood of further official investigations, and the specific decisions about what the book would contain and in what form. The book that appeared was an account of Rees-Jones's experience across the period leading up to and following the crash, organized around his personal narrative of his employment with the Al-Fayed organization, his service on Dodi Fayed's protection detail, the events of the night of the 31st of August, and the experience of his recovery from his injuries. It contained the account of his memory loss in the specific terms he had developed across the 3 years between the crash and the book's publication, describing the gap in his memory with the medical specificity that the neurological explanation for the gap required. Mohammed Al-Fayed's response to the book was the response of a man who had spent 3 years pursuing his own investigation of his son's death, and who had developed, across that investigation, conclusions about the crash's causes that were specific and that required the surviving witness's testimony to corroborate, or at minimum, not to contradict. Al-Fayed's conclusions organized around the theory of deliberate causation, around the claim that the crash had been arranged by agencies acting in the interests of the British establishment to prevent Diana from marrying his son and potentially bearing his child. Rees-Jones's book did not provide the corroboration Al-Fayed needed, because it did not contain the account of the moments before the crash that would have been most relevant to the deliberate causation theory. The memory was absent. The book described what Rees-Jones could say about the hours leading up to the crash, about the decision-making around the route taken and the choice of vehicle and driver, about the presence of the pursuing motorcycles and vehicles that were following the Mercedes through Paris in the period before the tunnel. But the specific moments inside the tunnel remained outside what his recovered memory contained. Al-Fayed publicly accused Rees-Jones of withholding information, of knowing more than the book disclosed and choosing, for reasons that Al-Fayed characterized as the result of pressure from sources interested in the suppression of the full account, not to provide it. The accusation placed Rees-Jones in the specific position of someone whose account is simultaneously challenged from the direction of the people who want more disclosure and managed from the direction of the legal and institutional frameworks that constrain what he can say. The accusation of deliberate withholding by someone in Rees-Jones's position requires examination against the medical evidence for the memory loss he described, because the accusation is only sustainable if the medical evidence for the loss is insufficient to account for the gap in his account. The medical evidence for traumatic amnesia in the specific circumstances he described is substantial, supported by the neurological literature on post-traumatic amnesia and by the specific nature of the injuries he sustained, which were consistent with the kind of cranial trauma that produces retrograde amnesia of the period immediately preceding the traumatic event. The medical evidence does not prove that he remembers nothing of the moments before the impact. Medical evidence for the existence of a condition that can produce the absence of specific memories does not establish that the specific memories at issue are in fact absent rather than withheld. The distinction between absent and withheld is one that medical evidence can support as a possibility without establishing as a certainty, and the space between medical possibility and certainty is where the speculation about his account has consistently operated. The speculation has been sustained across the years since the crash by the specific quality of the gap, its location in the most significant moments of the most significant event in the inquiry, the moments that any investigation of what happened in the tunnel most needed the testimony of the surviving witness to illuminate. A memory gap located precisely where the most critical testimony would have been is a gap whose location produces suspicion, regardless of the medical legitimacy of the explanation, because the location is too convenient for the people who benefit from the gap's existence to be evaluated without awareness of that benefit. The people who benefit from the gap's existence are not a single homogeneous group. The gap benefits everyone who has an interest in the absence of specific testimony about what occurred in the vehicle in the moments before the crash, and the interests at stake in those moments are various and not uniformly aligned. The French investigation's findings, which attributed the crash primarily to Henri Paul's driving and the pursuing vehicle's conduct in provoking a high-speed flight through Paris, are supported by the absence of testimony from Rees-Jones that would complicate those findings. The Al-Fayed theory of deliberate causation is neither supported nor contradicted by the gap, because the gap prevents the testimony that would most directly address the theory from existing in any form. The institution whose communications interests in the events of that night have been most consistently managed, the British royal family and the palace apparatus that manages its public communications, has maintained the most consistent silence about Rees-Jones's account and the questions it raises. The palace's communications strategy in relation to the investigations of Diana's death was organized around the position of non-engagement with the specific theories and counter-theories that the investigations generated, presenting the official investigation's findings as the appropriate mechanism for addressing the questions and declining to engage with accounts or allegations that fell outside those findings. The non-engagement position is the management position the institution adopts when any engagement would cost more than the silence. In the specific case of the questions surrounding Diana's death, engagement with the theories would have required the institution to address the specific claims in terms that could be examined against the evidence the theories cited, and the examination would have given the theories a legitimacy and a platform that the non-engagement position denied them. The non-engagement was more effective in managing the domestic British press environment, where the briefing network's relationships produced coverage that reflected the institutional preference for the official investigation's findings as the appropriate framework, than in the international environment, where the Al-Fayed theory and the broader questioning of the official account found an audience that was not inside the access relationships of the British Royal Press Corps. Rees-Jones published his book in 2000, gave interviews around its publication, and then largely withdrew from public discussion of the events of that night across the years that followed. The withdrawal was not total. He has appeared in documentary contexts and has provided accounts that were consistent with the book's version of events and with the memory gap he had described since the crash. The consistency across his public appearances is the consistency of someone who has settled on an account of what he knows and does not know, and who is presenting that account in a form that does not change significantly across the years of its repetition. The consistency could reflect the accurate account of a person who genuinely remembers what he says he remembers, and genuinely does not remember what he says he does not remember, maintaining the account accurately because it is accurate. It could also reflect the account of a person who has made decisions about what to say publicly, and who maintains those decisions consistently across public appearances, because departing from them would be more costly than the consistency is. The distinction between those two possibilities is not resolvable from the public record, because the public record contains what Rees-Jones has said and not what he has chosen not to say, and the boundary between those two categories is not visible from the outside. Operation Paget, the Metropolitan Police investigation conducted by Lord Stevens between 2004 and 2006, examined the Rees-Jones account as part of its comprehensive investigation of the circumstances of Diana's death. The investigation's report, published in December 2006, ran to 832 pages and examined the specific claims and counterclaims about the crash's causes with a thoroughness that the scope of a formal Metropolitan Police investigation allowed. The report's conclusions in relation to Rees-Jones were organized around the assessment of his account as consistent with the medical evidence for his injuries and with the broader evidence the investigation had assembled about the events of that night. The investigation found no evidence that his account of his memory loss was inaccurate or that he was withholding information about the events in the tunnel. It found the Al-Fayed theory of deliberate causation unsupported by the evidence the investigation had assembled across its 2-year examination of the available material. The findings are the findings of a thorough official investigation conducted by a senior and experienced police officer with extensive resources and the authority of the Metropolitan Police behind the investigation's operation. They represent the most comprehensive official examination of the questions surrounding Diana's death that has been conducted and published in Britain, and they constitute the most authoritative available answer to the specific questions the investigation was designed to address. What Operation Paget examined was the question of whether Diana's death was the result of deliberate causation, and the answer it provided was that the evidence did not support that conclusion. What it did not examine, in the specific terms that would have been most illuminating for the questions this account is tracing, was the broader question of the institutional management of the testimony of the people closest to Diana across the years of her life and the years following her death. The broader question is not a question that a murder investigation is designed to answer, because it is not a question about criminal conduct. It is a question about institutional management of knowledge, and institutional management of knowledge through the tools of legal obligation, employment relationship, and communications apparatus is not criminal in any of its specific operations, even when its aggregate effect is the sustained management of public understanding in directions that serve the institution's interests. The tools available to the palace in the management of knowledge about Diana's death were different from the tools available in the management of the protection officer's accumulated knowledge from her lifetime, because Rees-Jones was not a royal protection officer and was not subject to the specific obligations that the Royal Protection Group places on its serving and former officers. He was employed by Mohammed Al-Fayed's private security operation, and his obligations were organized around that employment relationship and around the French legal proceedings, rather than around the institutional obligations of royal service. The difference in the tools available produced a different form of institutional management in his case, less direct in its operation, through the specific channels the institution controls, and more indirect in its operation, through the broader management of the coverage environment in which his account was received. The palace's communications apparatus did not manage Rees-Jones through the review process it applied to Ken Wharfe's book. It managed the coverage of his account through the briefing network's shaping of how that account was contextualized in the domestic press environment, placing his testimony within the frame of the official investigation's findings and declining to engage with the questions his account left open in ways that would have given those questions greater public traction. The management of coverage rather than the management of the witness is the institutional management tool available when the witness is outside the institution's direct obligation structure. It is less precise than the direct obligation management because it operates on the coverage environment rather than on the person whose testimony is at issue. But it is effective in the specific sense that matters for the institution's interests, which is the sense of preventing the unanswered questions from accumulating into a coherent public challenge to the official account. The unanswered questions in Rees-Jones's case are specific. They are the questions about the moments immediately before the impact in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, about what the conditions in the vehicle were in those moments, about what, if anything, the pursuing vehicles and motorcycles were doing in the final seconds before the crash, and about what Rees-Jones observed in those moments before the memory gap that he describes closes off his account. The questions have remained unanswered since August 1997. They will remain unanswered as long as Rees-Jones's account of his memory gap is accurate, because he is the only surviving witness to those moments, and his account is the only source of direct testimony that could address them. If the account of the memory gap is accurate, the questions are permanently unanswered. If the account is not accurate, the questions remain unanswered, because the person who could answer them has chosen not to. The distinction between those two conditions is one that the public record cannot resolve, and the institution's management of the coverage environment has been organized around treating the distinction as resolved by the official investigation's conclusion, which is that the account is accurate and the questions are therefore permanently unanswered as a consequence of the trauma of the crash, rather than as a consequence of any choice about what to disclose. The inquest into Diana's death, conducted by Lord Justice Scott Baker in 2007 and 2008, examined many of the questions that Operation Paget had also examined, through the adversarial process of an inquest which gives interested parties the ability to question witnesses and to present evidence that the investigating magistrate or the police investigation may not have fully explored. The inquest jury returned a verdict of unlawful killing in April 2008, finding that the crash had been caused by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuing vehicles, and that the deaths of Diana and Dodi Fayed had been unlawful killings rather than accidents. The inquest verdict did not find evidence of deliberate causation by any party other than the drivers involved. It did not find that Rees-Jones's account of his memory loss was inaccurate. It placed the crash in the category of unlawful killing through gross negligence rather than in the category of the deliberate causation that Al-Fayed's theory required. Rees-Jones gave evidence at the inquest, in the formal setting of the inquest proceedings, and subject to the questioning of the legal teams representing the interested parties. His evidence was consistent with the account he had maintained since the crash, and with the book's version of events. The questioning by the legal teams examined the specific aspects of his account that remained most contested, probing the memory gap, and the decisions made about the route and the vehicle, and the driving on the night of the 31st of August. The evidence he gave added to the formal legal record of his account, without materially changing the account's substance. The specific questions about the moments before the impact remained in the condition they had been in since his first public accounts after the crash, questions that his stated memory gap prevented him from answering, and that the official investigation's examinations of the available evidence had not found an alternative source for addressing. The formal legal record of the inquest is the most complete official documentation of what Rees-Jones said under oath about the events of that night, produced through a process designed to test his account against the questioning of multiple legal teams with adversarial interests in different outcomes. The record shows an account that the adversarial process did not substantially shake, that the questions addressed to the memory gap did not produce departures from the position he had maintained since the crash, and that the inquest jury assessed as consistent with the broader conclusion of unlawful killing through gross negligence. What the formal legal record also shows, to anyone examining it with attention to what is present and what is absent, is the specific quality of an account that is complete in its coverage of what the witness says he remembers, and that stops precisely at the point where the most significant testimony would begin if the memory were available. The stopping point is not evidence of withholding. It is evidence of a gap, and the gap's medical explanation is adequate to account for it in the terms that medical evidence accounts for things. But the stopping point's location, at the threshold of the most significant moments in the most examined event in the investigation of Diana's death, produces in anyone examining the record a specific awareness of the gap's significance that the medical explanation alone does not fully satisfy. The satisfaction that the medical explanation provides is the satisfaction of a condition that explains what is absent rather than producing what is needed. The investigation needed testimony from the surviving witness about the moments before the impact. The medical explanation for the absence of that testimony is adequate. The adequacy of the explanation does not provide the testimony. It only explains its absence. Rees-Jones lives in a condition that few people who have been at the center of a significant historical event inhabit. The condition of being the surviving witness whose testimony most needed is the testimony he cannot provide because of an event's consequences that were themselves the source of the need. He survived the crash that his testimony would most illuminate. The survival produced the injury whose consequence is the absence of the testimony that the survival was most needed to provide. The condition is not one the institution arranged on any account of events that the official investigations support. The crash was the crash, the injury was the injury, and the memory gap is the gap that the injury produced. The institution's management of Rees-Jones's account has been the management of the coverage environment around an account that was already shaped by the crash's specific consequences before any institutional management was applied. The management was applied to that already shaped account. It did not produce the shape. It worked with the shape the crash had produced, organizing the coverage of Rees-Jones's account within the framework of the official investigation's conclusions, and managing the questions his account left open in the direction of the official explanations rather than in the direction of the counter-theories that found those explanations insufficient. The management's effectiveness is visible in the domestic British press environment, where the coverage of Rees-Jones's account has been predominantly organized around the official investigation's framework, and where the questions his account leaves open have been covered in the terms of those investigations' conclusions, rather than in the terms of the counter-theories. The management's limitations are visible in the international environment, and in the persistent public interest in the questions that the official investigation's conclusions did not fully close. Interest that the coverage of Al-Fayed's allegations and the documentary and book production around the crash have sustained across the years since 1997. The persistent interest is the evidence that the management of the coverage environment, effective in the domestic institutional sense, has not produced the closure that the official investigation's conclusions were designed to produce in the public understanding of what happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on the 31st of August, 1997. The closure has not been achieved because the gap in the surviving witnesses' account is located precisely where the closure most needed testimony to be provided, and the gap's location produces, in anyone who examines the record with attention to the relationship between what is present and what is absent, the specific awareness that the permanent record's most significant questions remain open. They remain open in the specific condition of questions whose answer is unavailable rather than unknown, which is a different condition from the condition of questions whose answer has not yet been found. The answer may exist in Rees-Jones's memory, in the form that the medical literature allows for, as a possibility, even when a person reports the memory's absence. If it exists there, the permanent record will never contain it, unless Rees-Jones chooses to provide it, or the medical consensus on his specific case changes in ways that alter the assessment of his memory's availability. The institution has managed the coverage of those questions in the direction of the official conclusions that close them. The closure is institutional rather than factual. The questions are in the record alongside the official conclusions, and they will remain in the record for as long as the record exists. Paul Burrell was in a different relationship to Diana's death than Trevor Rees-Jones, because Burrell had been inside Diana's household as her butler rather than her protection officer, and the knowledge he had accumulated was the knowledge of the domestic interior of her life rather than the operational exterior. His knowledge was different in kind from the knowledge of the protection officers, organized around the private life of the household rather than the security management of the principal's movements. The institution's management of Paul Burrell's knowledge took a form different from the management of the protection officers, a form that produced a legal confrontation of a kind that the protection officers' cases had not produced, and that placed the management of royal household knowledge into a public setting, a criminal trial, that the institution's management apparatus had not anticipated, and that produced consequences the management had not planned for. The consequences included the most extraordinary intervention in a criminal prosecution that the royal family has made in the modern era, and they belong to the following part of this account. Paul Burrell entered royal service in 1976 as a footman at Buckingham Palace at the age of 18. He served in various household positions across the years that followed, developing the specific skills of domestic royal service that the palace's household culture produces through sustained practice and the absorption of its requirements. He was assigned to Diana's household at Kensington Palace in 1987, the same year Ken Wharfe arrived on her protection detail, and he remained her principal butler until her death in August 1997. 10 years of domestic service to Diana produced knowledge of a different character from the knowledge accumulated by the protection officers. Wharfe's knowledge was the knowledge of the operational exterior, of Diana's movements and her security environment, and the specific texture of her public and semi-public life, observed from the position of the officer managing her physical safety. Burrell's knowledge was the knowledge of the domestic interior, of the private life of the household itself, of the conversations and the correspondence and the relationships and the daily rhythms of a woman's existence inside a home that was simultaneously a palace apartment and a private residence and a communications hub for one of the most scrutinized lives in the world. A butler in a royal household occupies a specific position in the domestic architecture that gives them access to the private life of the principal in ways that are distinct from every other household role. They manage the physical environment of the household, the rooms and the objects, and the domestic arrangements that the principal's daily life requires. They are present at the moments of transition between the public and the private, at the arrival and departure from the household that marks the boundary between the performance of the royal role and the existence inside the domestic space where the performance has temporarily stopped. They handle the correspondence and the gifts and the personal effects that accumulate across a life lived partly in public. And in handling those things, they develop a specific and detailed knowledge of the material record of that life. Burrell handled Diana's correspondence. He managed the household's objects and the specific items that the domestic interior of her life contained. He was present across 10 years of her existence inside Kensington Palace, in the years when her marriage was deteriorating and then ending, when her public profile was becoming the specific phenomenon of global scale that the 1990s produced, when her relationships and her private life were developing in the ways that the Morton tapes and the subsequent published accounts have documented. His knowledge was not the knowledge of a witness to specific dramatic events, in the way that a protection officer's knowledge includes the specific incidents and conversations and observable facts that sustained physical proximity produces. It was the knowledge of someone who had handled the material evidence of a life across 10 years, who had been present at the ordinary moments that the material evidence accumulated in, and who had developed across that decade the specific understanding of Diana as a person that 10 years of domestic service to someone produces when both parties allow the professional relationship the human dimension that the professional relationship's requirements normally constrain. Diana allowed it. By multiple accounts of people who knew her across those years, her relationship with Burrell was one of the closest personal relationships of her later life, organized around a mutual loyalty that exceeded the professional relationship's formal requirements, and that Diana acknowledged in the specific terms she used about him in the period before her death. She described him as the one person she trusted absolutely. That description, or language close to it, appears in multiple accounts of what she said about Burrell to people around her, and its consistency across those accounts gives it the weight of something she said regularly enough that the people around her retained it. The absolute trust was the product of 10 years of domestic proximity and the specific quality of Burrell's relationship with his principal that made the trust possible. He had not crossed the professional boundary in the way that the protection officer's cases describe. He had developed, across the years of the household service, a personal loyalty to Diana that he expressed through the specific acts of domestic devotion that the butler role permits, through the meticulous management of her household environment, and through the availability and responsiveness that a principal who relies on a trusted household member develops a dependency on across years of working together. When Diana died in Paris in August 1997, Burrell's position changed with the immediate and total finality that a principal's death produces in the life of their household staff. The household that had been the organizing structure of his professional existence for 10 years ceased to exist as an operational entity. The domestic arrangements that his role had managed were transferred to the administration of Diana's estate, organized through the executors appointed under her will. The principal whose trusted service he had provided was gone, and the household she had maintained was being wound down in the administrative manner that the deaths of prominent people with complex estates require. In the period of the estate's administration following Diana's death, Burrell took into his personal possession a significant number of items that had belonged to Diana, including personal correspondence, photographs, and various other objects from the household. The precise number of items he retained and the specific nature of those items was established during the subsequent legal proceedings, where the prosecution's case identified over 300 items that Burrell had taken from the estate. His account of why he retained the items was that he was keeping them in safekeeping, that he had taken them to protect them from dispersal or loss in the administrative process of the estate's winding down, and that Diana's trust in him had extended to an implicit authorization of exactly this kind of custodial role in the event of her death. The account was an account that the item's retention required, because the retention without such an account constituted the elements of the theft charge that the Crown Prosecution Service eventually brought against him. The investigation that produced the theft charge was not immediate. Several years passed between Diana's death in August 1997 and the formal commencement of the Metropolitan Police investigation into the items Burrell had retained. The investigation began after members of Diana's family, specifically her brother Earl Spencer and her son's households, became aware that Burrell had retained items from the estate and raised concerns about the retention with the appropriate authorities. the investigation produced evidence sufficient for the Crown Prosecution Service to charge Burrell with theft of items belonging to Diana's estate, the estate of Dodi Fayed, and the estate of the Prince of Wales. The charge was the most serious formal legal challenge that any member of Diana's household circle had faced in the period since her death, and it carried consequences for the trial of what Burrell knew about Diana's private life that the prosecution itself may not have fully anticipated when the charges were brought. A theft trial involving Diana's principal butler required the examination of what had been taken and why, and the examination of what had been taken required engaging with the specific nature of the items retained and their relationship to Diana's private life. Correspondence is evidence of what correspondence contains. Personal effects are evidence of the personal life they are associated with. A trial organized around the theft of over 300 items from Diana's household was, necessarily, a trial in which the private life of the household and the private life of its principal were the context within which the specific item's significance was established. Burrell's legal team understood this. The defense of his retention of the items required establishing the plausibility of his safekeeping account, and establishing that plausibility required presenting evidence of Diana's trust in him and the basis for that trust across 10 years of service. The presentation of that evidence was inevitably the presentation of aspects of the household's private life and the principal's private communications that the normal circumstances of domestic royal service would never produce in a public legal forum. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in October 2002. It attracted coverage in the Register that trials involving significant royal household information generate, which is intensive and sustained coverage organized around the specific details that emerge in proceedings rather than around the managed briefings that the palace communications apparatus uses to shape coverage in the non-adversarial contexts it normally operates within. An adversarial legal proceeding is not a context the palace's briefing network is designed to manage, because the adversarial process produces disclosures that no briefing network relationship can prevent when those disclosures are produced by the legitimate operation of the legal process. The coverage of the trial's early weeks reflected this. Specific details about Diana's private life, her correspondence, her relationships, her private fears and private communications were emerging through the trial process in ways that the palace's communications apparatus was not equipped to manage through its normal channels. The details were not the product of a journalist's investigation or a former staff member's book decision. They were the product of a criminal trial in a public court, produced through a process that carries its own authority and that the palace's management tools cannot reach in the way they can reach a book manuscript or a press briefing. Several weeks into the trial, the prosecution's case was proceeding in the direction that criminal trials proceed when the evidence is organized around establishing that specific items were taken without authorization. The defense's case was proceeding in the direction that Burrell's legal team had structured it, around the safekeeping account and the evidence of Diana's trust in him that the account required to be credible. On the 1st of November 2002, the prosecution announced that it was offering no further evidence against Paul Burrell. The trial collapsed. Burrell was formally acquitted of all charges. The reason the prosecution offered no further evidence was that a specific piece of information had emerged which the prosecution had not previously possessed, and which fundamentally altered the evidentiary landscape of the case. The information was that the Queen had recalled a conversation she had held with Paul Burrell in the period following Diana's death, in which Burrell had told the Queen that he was retaining certain items from Diana's household for safekeeping. The Queen's recollection had been communicated to the prosecution through the appropriate channels, and the prosecution had assessed that the recollection, if presented in evidence, would substantially undermine the prosecution's case by providing direct corroboration of the safekeeping account that Burrell had been advancing as his defense. If the Queen had been told about the safekeeping arrangement and had not objected to it, the prosecution's case that Burrell had taken the items without authorization was substantially weakened by the existence of that conversation. The prosecution's decision to offer no further evidence and the trial's consequent collapse was the immediate practical result of the Queen's recollection becoming known to the prosecution. The sequence of events that produced that result is what the public discussion of the Burrell case has examined most extensively in the years since the trial. because the specific circumstances of how and when the Queen's recollection arose and was communicated produced a coverage event of considerable significance. The Queen's recollection arose and was communicated after weeks of trial in which the proceedings had been producing disclosures about Diana's private life through the adversarial process. It arose at a specific point in the trial's progress, not before the trial began or in the initial period of its proceedings, but during the trial and after the specific disclosures that the adversarial process had been generating. The timing produced the specific question that the coverage of the trial's collapse has consistently organized itself around, which is the question of whether the timing was coincidental, a genuinely independent act of memory that occurred during the trial and was promptly communicated once it occurred, or whether the timing reflected a decision about when the recollection should be communicated, a decision shaped by awareness of what the trial's continuing proceedings would produce in terms of further disclosures about Diana's private life. The institution's account of the timing is the account of a genuine independent recollection, communicated as soon as its relevance to the proceedings was recognized. The palace's formal statements around the trial's collapse were organized around the position that the information had been provided to the prosecution as soon as its significance was understood, and that the Queen had not been aware before the trial of the specific legal significance of the conversation she recalled. The account is plausible in the sense that genuine independent recollection during a significant public event is a documented human experience. Trials involving matters close to people's lives do produce genuine recollections of previously unconsidered information in people who are following those trials and who are reminded by the trial's proceedings of events in their own experience. The account is also, given the specific timing and the specific circumstances, an account that the coverage has found difficult to accept as fully adequate, because the recollection's emergence during a trial that was producing disclosures about Diana's private life, at a point in those proceedings where the disclosures were continuing and appeared likely to continue, is a timing that coincides with the institutional interest in ending the proceedings too precisely to be examined without awareness of that coincidence. The examination of the coincidence is the examination that the palace's management apparatus has consistently sought to prevent from becoming the dominant framework for the trial's collapse, through the institutional register of appropriate restraint in relation to a private recollection that happened to be relevant to criminal proceedings. The restraint register manages the examination by placing the recollection in the category of private matters that institutions do not discuss publicly in detail, which prevents the specific circumstances of the recollection's emergence and communication from being examined against the institutional interests that the trial's collapse served. The institutional interests that the trial's collapse served were specific and significant. The trial, had it continued, would have continued producing disclosures about Diana's private life through the adversarial process. The disclosures would have included further evidence about the specific items Burrell had retained, which would have required engaging with the content of Diana's correspondence and the specific nature of the personal effects the prosecution was organized around. The correspondence in particular was a potential source of disclosure that the palace had strong institutional interests in preventing from entering the public record through the adversarial mechanism of a criminal trial. Diana's correspondence across the years of her marriage and the post-separation period was extensive and included letters to a range of people about a range of matters that touched on her private life, her fears about the institution, and her relationships with the people around her. The specific content of that correspondence was not the content the palace's communications apparatus would have chosen to manage into public circulation through the mechanism of a criminal trial. The managed version of Diana's narrative that the posthumous institutional management had been organizing since her death was a version shaped by the briefings and the approved accounts and the managed publications that the palace controlled. The adversarial trial process was producing a different version, shaped by the evidentiary requirements of the prosecution and defense cases, rather than by the institutional preference for managed disclosure. Burrell, after his acquittal, published a memoir. A Royal Duty appeared in 2003 and drew on his 10 years of service to Diana in the specific terms of a person who had been acquitted of theft charges and who was now free of the constraint that the pending criminal proceedings had placed on his ability to speak publicly about what he knew. The book was the most significant disclosure from someone inside Diana's immediate domestic circle that had appeared since the Morton book, and it drew on Burrell's specific position inside the household across 10 years to provide accounts of Diana's private life, her relationships, her fears, and her understanding of the institution's management of her life that the Morton tapes had first made public in the specific terms of Diana's own voice. The palace's response to a royal duty was the response it gives to publications by former staff that it finds problematic but cannot prevent, because the legal proceedings that might have provided a mechanism for preventing the publication had collapsed before producing a conviction that would have constrained Burrell's ability to publish. The response was organized around the Institutional Disappointment Register, the communication through the briefing network of the palace's view that the publication was a breach of the trust and confidence that the butler relationship required, and the specific suggestion that the book's timing and content reflected commercial motivation rather than the genuine service to Diana's memory that Burrell presented it as. The disappointment register was the management tool available. The legal tool had ceased to be available when the trial collapsed. The palace's communications apparatus was therefore operating in the specific constrained environment of managing the coverage of a publication it found unwelcome without the legal mechanism that the trial might have provided for constraining the publication's content or preventing its appearance. The management of the coverage through the disappointment register produced some of the domestic coverage in the direction the palace preferred, reflecting the institutional view of the publication in ways that the briefing network's established relationships with royal correspondents reliably produce. It produced less effect in the international environment and in the sections of the domestic coverage organized around the book's content, rather than the palace's view of it. Burrell has continued to speak about Diana across the years since the book's publication, in the specific mode of a person whose acquittal freed him from the legal constraints of the criminal proceedings and whose subsequent publications and public statements have added progressively to the public record of what his 10 years of domestic service to her produced in terms of knowledge. The progressive additions have not been organized around a single comprehensive disclosure. They have been organized around the specific public and media contexts in which he has appeared, producing an accumulating record of accounts that the palace's management apparatus has found consistently difficult to manage because each new appearance and each new disclosure operates in a public context that the briefing network's relationships can shape but not control. The accumulating record contains specific accounts of Diana's private fears, of her understanding of the institution's management of her life, and of the specific circumstances of the years of her marriage and the post-separation period that Burrell observed from his position inside the household. The accounts are those of a person who was in a specific position and who is describing what that position allowed him to observe, with the limitations of that position's specific access and the specific framing that his own perspective on the events produces. Among the material that Burrell has described across his public appearances is material relating to Diana's fears about her own physical safety, fears she had communicated to people around her in the period before her death, and that she had documented in specific written communications that Burrell has referenced in his public accounts. The most significant documented instance of Diana's own expression of her fears about her safety is the letter she reportedly wrote, approximately 10 months before her death, to her solicitor Paul Burrell. The confusion of names reflects the specific circumstances of the Burrell case, where the butler who shared a first name with her solicitor has been cited in relation to the letter in ways that the public discussion of the matter has not always clearly distinguished. The letter that Diana wrote expressed her belief, stated in direct terms, that she made no effort to soften, that she was going to be killed in a car accident, arranged to clear the way for Charles to remarry. The letter was produced at the inquest into Diana's death and formed part of the inquest's examination of the broader questions about the circumstances of her death. Its existence and its content are matters of documented public record, established through the inquest process. The letter's content is the most direct available expression, in Diana's own words in a contemporary document, rather than in retrospective accounts by the people around her, of her own understanding of what the institution was capable of doing with the people it found inconvenient. The letter places Diana's belief about the institution's management of threats to its interests in a form that the public record contains in the specific authority of a primary source document written by the person most relevant to the questions the document addresses. Whether Diana's specific belief in the letter was accurate is a question that the official investigations examined and found no evidence to support in its most literal interpretation. The finding is the same finding that the official investigations produced in relation to her belief about Barry Mannakee, organized around the absence of evidence for deliberate causation, rather than the presence of evidence that deliberate causation did not occur. The distinction between those two conditions is the distinction that the coverage of the official investigation's findings has consistently managed in the direction of the findings' authority, rather than in the direction of the distinction's significance. The absence of evidence for deliberate causation is not the same as the presence of evidence that deliberate causation did not occur. It is the finding of an investigation that examined the available evidence and found that the available evidence did not establish deliberate causation. The available evidence is a subset of all relevant evidence, and the subset's boundaries are determined by what the investigation was able to access and examine. What the investigation was able to access and examine was determined partly by the institutional management of the knowledge held by the people who were closest to Diana across the years of her life and in the period immediately surrounding her death. The management of that knowledge through the specific tools that the preceding parts of this account have described produced a situation in which the evidence available to the official investigations was the evidence that the institutional management had not succeeded in containing, rather than the full body of evidence that the proximity of the people closest to Diana had produced. The Burrell trial's collapse is the most dramatic single illustration of the institutional management of Diana's private knowledge in the specific form of a legal intervention that prevented the adversarial disclosure mechanism from producing its full evidentiary output. The intervention did not produce evidence of deliberate causation in anything the trial proceedings contained or the trial's collapse generated. It produced evidence of an institution that found the adversarial disclosure of Diana's private correspondence and private effects sufficiently concerning to deploy, through the mechanism of the Queen's recollection, the most direct institutional intervention available in the legal proceedings to end those proceedings before their disclosure potential was fully realized. The intervention is documented in the institutional record of the trial's collapse. It is the documented instance, in the public record of the Burrell case, of the institutional management of Diana's private knowledge operating in the most visible form it has taken across all the cases this account examines. It is visible because the legal proceedings it ended were themselves visible, conducted in a public court, and covered by the press in the intensive manner that adversarial criminal proceedings involving royal household matters generate. The visibility distinguishes it from the other forms of management that the preceding parts have described. The review process that shaped Wharfe's book operated in a closed administrative process. The obligation structure that governed the protection officer's silence operated through the legal framework of official secrets and contractual obligation without requiring any individual institutional act in each specific case. The management of Rees-Jones's account operated through the coverage environment rather than through any direct institutional engagement with his testimony. The Burrell case produced a direct institutional engagement with legal proceedings through an intervention that ended those proceedings before their disclosure potential was exhausted. The engagement is documented in the trial record and in the subsequent accounts of how the trial's collapse occurred. It is the most legible instance in the public record of the institution acting directly to prevent the further disclosure of Diana's private knowledge through a mechanism the institution had not controlled and whose continued operation was producing results the institution found concerning. The specific content of what the continued operation was producing and what further results the continued proceedings might have generated is not in the public record because the proceedings did not continue. The gap in the public record, where the trial's further proceedings would have been, is the institutional management's most specific achievement in the Burrell case, the prevention of a body of evidence from reaching the record, rather than the management of evidence that has already entered it. The gap is the management's product. It is not visible in the positive sense of being a thing that is present in the record. It is visible in the negative sense of being the absence of what the trial's continuation would have produced, an absence whose existence can be established by examining what the trial was producing before it stopped, and inferring what its continuation would have added. The inference is always inference rather than evidence, because inference about what an uncompleted legal proceeding would have produced is the inference that the prevention of the proceeding's completion makes necessary. The institution's management converted the possibility of direct evidence into the necessity of inference, which is the management tool's most effective operation, the replacement of what would have been documentary fact with the inferential question of what the documentary fact would have said. Paul Burrell has continued to speak about Diana across the 20-plus years since the trial's collapse and the book's publication, in a public profile that has declined from the intensity of the trial period, but that has maintained a presence in the documentary and interview contexts that the sustained public interest in Diana's life generates. His account of what he knew and what the trial's collapse prevented from entering the public record has developed across those years in the specific way that accounts develop when the person providing them is operating in public without the constraint that the pending criminal proceedings had placed on them, and with the awareness of what the institution's management apparatus responds to when they speak. The awareness produces the specific quality of calculation that characterizes his public presentations across the years since the trial, the quality of someone who has made decisions about what to say and is maintaining those decisions while navigating the specific boundaries that the continued institutional management of Diana's posthumous narrative has not ceased to enforce, even in the absence of the legal mechanism that the trial provided. The legal mechanism ceased when the trial collapsed. The institutional management continued. The continued management does not have the specific legal tool that the trial period provided. It has the tools that are available in the absence of pending legal proceedings, the obligation structure, and the briefing network, and the reputational management apparatus that the palace deploys against former staff whose public statements it finds inconvenient. Those tools have shaped the coverage of Burrell's post-trial public statements in the specific direction they are designed to shape coverage, toward the institutional disappointment register and away from the substance of what the statements contain. The shaping has been partially effective in the domestic environment and less effective in the international environment, in the same pattern that the management of the other cases' coverage has produced. The partial effectiveness is the condition the institution has operated in across all of the cases this account has examined. The management has prevented some of the knowledge from reaching the public record in its full form. It has not prevented the public record from containing enough of the knowledge, through the partial disclosures, and the legal records, and the managed publications, and the unmanaged public statements, and the adjacent witness accounts, to make the pattern of the management itself visible to anyone examining the record with the attention to what is present and what is absent that the examination requires. The pattern is what Operation Paget examined in relation to the specific question of Diana's death, and what it did not examine in relation to the broader question of the institutional management of knowledge about Diana's life. The broader question is the question that the following part of this account addresses, through the examination of what Operation Paget found and what the specific limits of the official investigation's scope prevented it from finding. The finding and the limits are both in the public record. They sit together in the 832 pages of the report that Lord Stevens published in December 2006, and they tell, in their combination of what was examined and what was not, the specific shape of an official investigation that addressed one question and not another, and whose scope was determined by the authorities who commissioned it, rather than by the full range of questions that Diana's private knowledge and the institutional management of that knowledge had left open in the years since August 1997. Lord Stevens of Kirkwelpington was 62 years old when he was appointed to lead the Metropolitan Police investigation into the circumstances of Diana's death. He had recently retired as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the most senior operational policing position in Britain, after a career that had included leading the investigation into collusion between security forces and loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, an investigation whose findings on institutional misconduct had been among the most significant produced by any British police inquiry in the preceding decades. His appointment to lead the Diana investigation carried the specific authority of a senior figure whose record showed the capacity and the institutional confidence to investigate difficult questions about powerful institutions without flinching from where the evidence led. The cases examined in the preceding parts of this account span approximately 20 years, from Barry Mannakee's transfer in the spring of 1987 to the publication of Operation Paget's findings in December 2006. They involve different people, different institutional relationships, different specific forms of management, and different outcomes in terms of what each person was ultimately able to say and in what context they were able to say it. They have been examined individually, across the official investigations and the press coverage and the public discussion of Diana's life and death, as separate incidents with separate explanations. Held together, they describe something the individual examinations do not produce. The individual examinations produce the explanation appropriate to each case. Mannakee was transferred because a protection officer's personal relationship with his principal exceeded the professional boundary, and the institution acted to restore the boundary through the mechanism available to it, which was reassignment. Wharfe published within the cleared limits of the review process, which is the mechanism the institution applies to former staff, whose publication decision it cannot prevent, and whose content it can shape through the obligation structure's enforcement. Rees-Jones's account of his memory loss is consistent with the medical evidence for his injuries, and the memory gap's existence is adequately explained by the trauma he sustained. The Burrell trial collapsed when relevant information was communicated to the prosecution, as the appropriate conduct of a witness with relevant information requires. Operation Paget examined the deliberate causation question thoroughly and found no supporting evidence. Each individual explanation is adequate in the specific terms it addresses. The adequacy of each individual explanation is what makes the individual examination approach effective for the institution, because the individual examination approach produces adequate individual explanations that prevent the pattern from being the unit of analysis. When the pattern is not the unit of analysis, the institution's consistent response to a consistent type of problem remains invisible beneath the adequate individual explanations for each of the pattern's instances. The pattern becomes visible when the instances are examined as a group rather than individually, when the question shifts from what happened in each specific case to what the cases have in common, and whether the commonality reflects a consistent institutional response organized around a consistent institutional interest. The commonality is specific and present across all of the cases examined. In each case, a person had accumulated knowledge of Diana's private experience through direct proximity to her. In each case, the institution identified the person's knowledge as a concern requiring management. In each case, the management was applied through the specific tools available in the specific circumstances of the case. In each case, the management was organized around the reduction of the knowledge's reach, rather than around any engagement with the person or their knowledge as legitimate in its own terms. The reduction of reach, rather than engagement with legitimacy, is the pattern's defining characteristic. The institution did not, in any of the cases examined, respond to the accumulated knowledge of proximity by providing the person who held it with a channel through which the knowledge could be communicated in a managed form that served both the person's legitimate interest in describing their experience and the institution's legitimate interest in managing the public presentation of its principal's private life. The absence of that channel is telling. Its absence means that the institution's management of the people who knew too much was not organized around finding a way to accommodate the legitimate dimensions of their knowledge within the institutional management framework. It was organized around the prevention or reduction of the knowledge's reach, through mechanisms that prioritize the institution's interest in controlling the knowledge's circulation over the legitimate interests of the people who held it. The legitimacy of the interests of the people who held the knowledge is the element the pattern's institutional framing consistently denies. In the institutional framing, the knowledge is not the legitimate property of the person who accumulated it through direct proximity to the principal. It is institutional information, produced in the course of institutional service and therefore subject to the institutional obligations that govern the communication of information produced in that way. The person's experience of the principal, their relationship with the principal, their knowledge of the principal's private life accumulated through sustained proximity, is institutional property managed under institutional rules rather than personal experience belonging to the person who had it. The framing has legal support in the official secrets provisions and the contractual non-disclosure obligations that the people inside the institutional arrangements operate under. Those provisions and obligations are real, legally enforceable, and not without legitimate purpose. The protection of sensitive information about security arrangements and the private lives of public figures from unrestricted disclosure is a legitimate institutional interest that the provisions and obligations serve. The provisions and obligations are also, in their specific operation across the cases this account has examined, the legal framework within which the institutional management of Diana's private knowledge was conducted. They provided the legal basis for the review process that shaped Wharfe's publication. They provided the legal basis for the obligation structure that governed the silence of the majority of protection officers who served with Diana and who have not published or spoken publicly about their service. They provided the legal backdrop against which the Burrell trial's proceedings were managed, because the material the trial was producing related to information generated within the institutional household arrangements that the obligations were designed to protect. The provisions and obligations are legitimate in their general application. Their specific application across the Diana cases produced a pattern of management that served the institutional interest in containing Diana's private knowledge within the institutional management framework rather than in the public record, across a series of cases that together constitute a sustained institutional effort to prevent the knowledge of the people who were closest to Diana from accumulating in the public record in a form the institution did not control. The effort was partially successful. The partially successful nature of the management is the condition the public record is in, containing more than the institution's management had aimed to contain, and less than the full knowledge of the people who were closest to Diana would have produced without the management's operation. The partial success is the specific quality of the management's achievement across the pattern's instances, visible in the gap between what is in the record and what the proximity of the people in the cases would have produced without the management's intervention. The gap is not uniform across the cases. The management's success in containing specific knowledge varies by case, reflecting the different tools available in different circumstances and the different degrees to which the specific knowledge at issue was susceptible to the available management tools. Mannakee's knowledge was contained most completely by the specific finality of his death 6 weeks after his transfer. Whether the death was connected to the transfer, which the official investigation found no evidence to support. The effect of the death was the permanent removal of the most proximate witness to whatever the relationship with Diana had produced in terms of direct knowledge of her private life across the years of his assignment. The permanence of that removal is the most complete instance of the management's operation across the pattern's cases, in the specific sense that the knowledge Mannakee carried went with him in a way that no other management tool applied to any of the other cases produced. Wharfe's knowledge was partially contained through the review process that shaped his publication and the obligation structure that governed his subsequent public statements. The partial containment is visible in the texture of his public presentations, which consistently convey the awareness of knowledge extending beyond what the constrained communication space permits. The cleared publication and the subsequent constrained appearances together constitute the institution's most formally documented management success across the pattern's cases, in the sense that the management left an institutional footprint in the review process that confirms the management's operation in a way that the other cases' management did not produce in such formally documented form. Rees-Jones's knowledge is contained in the specific way that a genuine memory gap contains it, or in the way that a decided account of a memory gap contains it, depending on which interpretation of his stated loss is accurate. The containment, in either interpretation, is complete in its practical effect, because the specific moments about which his knowledge would have been most significant are the moments that his stated memory gap covers, and that therefore either genuinely do not exist in his accessible memory, or exist in memory he has decided not to describe. The completeness of the practical containment, regardless of the interpretation applied to its cause, is the specific quality of his case that distinguishes it from the other pattern instances in which the management produced partial rather than complete containment. Burrell's knowledge was managed through the most dramatic single institutional act visible in the pattern's cases, the intervention that ended the criminal trial before the adversarial disclosure mechanism had reached its full evidentiary potential. The management's effect in his case was the prevention of a body of disclosures that the trial process was producing, rather than the constraint of disclosures that had already entered the public record. The prevention is the negative space in the public record where the trial's further proceedings would have been, visible in the inferred form of what the adversarial process was generating before the intervention ended it. The four cases together, with the broader background of the obligation structure's management of the majority of protection officers who served Diana and who have maintained the silence the obligations require, constitute the pattern's full visible extent in the public record. The majority of the management's operation is not visible in the public record as specific cases, because the management of the majority was successful in preventing their knowledge from reaching the public record in any form that required specific institutional action to contain. The majority's silence is the management's most complete achievement, the knowledge of dozens of protection officers and household staff who served Diana across the years of her marriage and the post-separation period, and who have not published or spoken publicly about their service in ways that required institutional response. The majority's silence is also the most invisible dimension of the management pattern, because the silence of people who have not spoken does not appear in the public record in a form that can be examined. It appears only in the inference that the absence of their accounts represents, the inference that people who were in a position to know significant things about Diana's private experience have not communicated those things in public form, and that the obligation structure and the professional loyalty and the institutional management of the consequences of speaking have been the conditions under which their silence was maintained. The inference is the specific kind of evidence that the management apparatus's most effective operations produce. The management of the majority was effective enough to prevent the public record from containing their accounts. The prevention means the accounts are not in the record. The account's absence is the evidence of the management's success, available only as an inference about what the record would contain if the management had not operated. Inference about what is absent is always weaker than evidence about what is present, and the management apparatus's most effective operations are the ones that produce inferences about absences rather than documents about presences. The cases in this account are the cases where the management did not produce complete absence. They are the cases where something entered the public record despite the management's operation, where the knowledge found a pathway into the record that the management tools available in each specific case were not sufficient to close before the knowledge passed through. They are the pattern's visible instances rather than the pattern's invisible majority, and they are therefore a sample of the management's operation rather than its full extent. The sample's evidence is the evidence available. The full extent's evidence is the inference about the absence that the sample allows. What the sample's evidence tells, across the four cases examined, is that the institution's management of the knowledge of the people closest to Diana was consistent in its organizing interest, which was the management of that knowledge's reach in the direction of the institutional narrative about Diana's life, rather than in the direction of the full account that the proximity of those people had produced. The consistency of the organizing interest across cases with different specific circumstances and different available management tools is the pattern's primary evidence, because consistency across different circumstances, produced by different available tools, points to a consistent underlying interest rather than to different specific reactions to different specific situations. The consistency is documented in the specific tools deployed in each case and in the direction those tools consistently served. Transfer in one case, obligation structure management across the majority of cases, review process management in the most formally documented case, coverage environment management in the case where the witness was outside the direct obligation structure, legal proceedings intervention in the case where the adversarial process had breached the institutional control of disclosure, different tools, consistent direction. The direction in each case was the management of Diana's private knowledge in the institutional interest, away from the form in which the proximity of the knowledge's holder would have made it available without the management's intervention. The direction serves a specific institutional interest that this account has identified across each of the cases. The institutional interest is the management of Diana's posthumous narrative, and during her lifetime, the management of the contemporary narrative about the marriage and the institution's relationship with its most publicly significant member in the modern era. The management of that narrative required the management of the knowledge of the people whose proximity to Diana gave them the ability to provide an account of the narrative's subject that was independent of the institutional management apparatus's preferred version. The independence of the potential account is what the management apparatus's operation was organized against. An account of Diana's private experience provided by someone who had been inside that experience through sustained proximity is an account whose authority comes from direct observation rather than from institutional briefing, and whose content reflects the observed reality rather than the managed version that the briefing network produces. The independence of the source and the authority of the direct observation are the qualities that make the knowledge of proximity specifically threatening to institutional narrative management in a way that other forms of knowledge about Diana's life are not. Journalism about Diana drew on sources, documentation, and institutional briefings filtered through the journalism's own framework. Biography drew on archives, interviews, and secondary accounts organized around the biographer's analytical perspective. Official communications drew on the managed version the institutional communications apparatus produced. All of these categories of knowledge about Diana were susceptible to the institutional management apparatus's influence through the briefing relationships and the access arrangements and the management of what sources were available to the journalists and biographers who were producing them. The knowledge of proximity was not susceptible to those influences in the same way because it was produced through direct observation rather than through the mediated channels that the institutional management apparatus was designed to influence. A protection officer who had spent 6 years observing Diana from the position of her principal protection officer had knowledge that no briefing and no access management could produce and no denial could erase, because the knowledge was in the officer's direct memory of direct observation. The immunity of direct observational memory from the institutional management tools designed for mediated knowledge channels is what made the knowledge of proximity specifically threatening and what organized the institution's management response around the tools available for managing the person rather than managing the information. The information could not be managed through the channels designed for information management. The person who held it could be managed through the tools available for personnel management, obligation enforcement, coverage environment management, and in the most dramatic case, legal proceedings management. The management of the person, rather than the information, is the pattern's structural characteristic. It is the structural characteristic that follows necessarily from the specific nature of the knowledge at issue, which is knowledge that resides in personal memory and cannot be managed through the information channels that institutional management apparatus is designed to influence. Diana understood this about the institution's management of the people around her. Her Morton tapes are evidence not only of what she believed about specific cases, but of her broader understanding of the institutional management of proximity as a systematic response to a systematic concern. She described the institution's response to the people who came close to her in terms that suggest she had developed, across her years inside it, a general account of how the response operated and what its organizing interest was. Her account was shaped by her emotional experience of the management's operation, by the specific grief and fear that the Mannakee case produced in her, and by the broader anxiety about surveillance and management that the years of her marriage had accumulated. The emotional shaping made her account susceptible to the dismissal that the institutional management applied to it, positioning it as the product of personal distress rather than institutional observation. The positioning was the management's response to Diana's own account of the management. The institution managed Diana's description of the institutional management pattern in the same way it managed the knowledge of the protection officers, by deploying the available tools in the direction of reducing the account's reach and authority rather than engaging with its substance. The available tool in Diana's case was the pathologizing framing, the description of her beliefs as the product of psychological distress, rather than of informed observation, which placed her account in the category of unreliable testimony rather than the category of direct witness evidence. The pathologizing framing was applied to her account of the Mannakee case specifically, and to her broader account of the institutional management more generally. It was effective in managing the domestic British press coverage of her beliefs in the period when she was alive, and the institutional management apparatus could deploy the briefing network against her statements. It was less effective after her death, when the Morton tapes were released and her account could be read alongside the subsequent case's evidence in a form that placed the pathologizing framing alongside the substantive evidence for the pattern she had identified. The evidence for the pattern across the subsequent cases is the evidence this account has assembled from the public record of those cases. The evidence does not establish the most extreme version of what Diana described, the version organized around deliberate causation in the Mannakee case, and in the letter she wrote about her own anticipated death. The official investigations examined those most extreme versions and found no supporting evidence. The evidence does establish the pattern she identified, the consistent institutional management of the people who knew too much, through the specific tools available in each specific case, in the direction of containing the knowledge's reach within the institutional management framework, rather than permitting it to enter the public record in a form independent of that management. The establishment of the pattern is not the establishment of criminal conduct. The pattern's instances do not constitute crimes, individually or collectively, in the terms that British law defines crimes and that official investigations examine. The transfer was legal. The obligation structure is legal. The review process is legal. The coverage management is legal. The intervention in the Burrell trial was legal. The scope determination for Operation Paget was within the legitimate authority of the people who determined it. The legality of each operation is the institution's protection against the examination of the pattern's implications in legal terms. The legal protection is real, and the examination of the pattern cannot produce findings of criminal conduct that the legal system could act on, because the pattern's operations are legal operations organized around legal mechanisms. What the legal protection does not protect against is the examination of the pattern's implications in terms of the public's understanding of how the institution managed the knowledge of Diana's private experience and whose interests that management served. The examination of those implications is not a legal examination. It is the examination of documented institutional conduct against the question of what the conduct's consistency reveals about the institutional interests it served and what those interests have cost in terms of the public's access to Diana's private experience through the accounts of the people who were closest to her. The cost is specific. The cost is the gap in the public record between what the proximity of the people in the pattern's cases would have produced without the management's operation and what the public record actually contains after the management's operation. The gap's extent is inferred from the evidence available about each case's management, about the review process that shaped the publication, about the obligation structure that maintained the majority's silence, about the trial that was ended before its disclosure potential was reached. The inference tells that the gap is substantial. The management across the pattern's cases was effective enough to prevent a significant body of direct observational knowledge of Diana's private experience from entering the public record in the form that the people who held it would have provided without the management's constraints. The body of knowledge prevented from entering the record is the cost, in public understanding terms, of the institutional management of the people who knew too much. Diana knew they knew too much. She knew it because she had been with them when they were accumulating the knowledge, and she understood the institutional response to that accumulation because she had watched it operate across multiple cases with a consistency that formed her general account of the pattern. The account she recorded on Morton's tapes is the only contemporary first-person description of the institutional management pattern provided by the principal whose private experience was the management subject. The description was managed, after Diana's death, by the same institutional apparatus that had managed the protection officer's knowledge. The description was placed in the pathologizing frame that reduced its authority as institutional observation. The pathologizing frame was effective in the domestic press environment and less effective in the international environment and the permanent record, in the same pattern that the management of the subsequent cases produced. The permanent record contains Diana's description of the pattern, alongside the evidence of the pattern's subsequent instances, and the coexistence in the record of the description and the evidence is the condition that the management apparatus has been unable to prevent, despite the consistency of its operation across the cases. The coexistence tells, to anyone examining it with attention to the relationship between the description and the evidence, that the description was not the product of personal distress in the specific and dismissible sense that the pathologizing frame required it to be. The description was the observation of a person who had been inside the institutional management for long enough to understand its consistent operation, who had watched it operate against the people she trusted across multiple cases, and who had developed from that watching an account of the pattern that the subsequent evidence of the pattern's further instances has consistently supported rather than contradicted. The support is not perfect. The most extreme version of Diana's account, the version organized around deliberate causation in the Mannakee case, has not been supported by the official investigation's findings. The extreme version may reflect the distortion that personal grief and fear introduce into the observation of institutional conduct, the tendency to attribute malice to what may have been, in its specific operational form, the legal and institutional management of a professional boundary that had been crossed, rather than the elimination of a witness who knew too much. The less extreme version, the version organized around the consistent institutional management of the people whose proximity to Diana produced knowledge that the institution found threatening to the management of its own narrative, is supported by the evidence across the cases examined. The support is the evidence this account has assembled from the public record, organized around the cases and the institutional responses to those cases, and the consistency of the direction those responses served. The pattern is in the public record. It has been in the public record across the years since Diana's death, assembled across the accumulation of partial disclosures and legal proceedings records and primary source accounts and adjacent witness testimony that the management apparatus did not fully contain. The assembly has not been done before in the form this account provides, because the individual examination approach has been the dominant mode of engaging with the cases, and the individual examination approach produces adequate individual explanations that prevent the pattern from being visible as the primary unit of analysis. The pattern as the primary unit of analysis is what this account has provided. The pattern's visibility, assembled from the evidence that the individual cases contribute to it, is the condition in which anyone examining the public record of Diana's protection arrangements and the institutional management of the knowledge those arrangements produced will now encounter the cases. The encounter will not produce certainty about the full extent of what the management contained within the institutional framework, rather than permitting into the public record. The management's most complete operations are the ones that left no public trace. The silence of the majority of protection officers whose service to Diana has produced no published account and no public statement. The silence maintained by the obligation structure and the professional loyalty that the structure reinforces. The silence of the majority is the permanent condition in the public record, maintained by the mechanisms that have governed it since the officer's service with Diana ended. Some of the majority will carry that silence permanently. Others may, across the years of the accumulation that the pattern's less complete instances have initiated, make the same calculation that Ken Wharfe made in 2002 and arrive at the same decision, the decision to enter the public record with an account of their service within the constraints that the obligation structure permits. Each such decision adds to the public record in ways that the management apparatus has not been able to prevent the preceding decisions from adding. The accumulation is ongoing. The record is not closed. The management apparatus continues to operate in the direction of containing the knowledge within the institutional framework, rather than permitting its entry into the public record in forms independent of that management. The containment is partial. The pattern is visible. The record holds what it holds. The management continues around it, as it has continued across the 2 decades since Diana's death, through the legal tools and the obligation structures and the coverage management and the institutional vocabulary of appropriate restraint that have been the consistent apparatus of the institution's response to the people who stood too close and knew too much. The people who knew too much are still out there. Some of them have spoken in the forms the management allowed. Some have maintained the silence that the management produced. Some are in the permanent condition of the silence that ends all management concerns, having died with what they knew unspoken in any public form. Diana is among them. The specific knowledge she held, the knowledge of what the institution had done to the people she trusted, and what those people had known about her that made the institution find them threatening, is in the public record, in the form of the Morton tapes, and the letter, and the accounts of the people around her who retained what she said to them. The form is not the form that she would have chosen. She chose the Morton tapes because no legitimate channel for the account she wanted to give existed inside the institution that was managing her. She used the only channel available to her, the secret recording passed outside the palace, through the specific method designed to prevent the institution from knowing it existed. The institution knew it existed anyway. It managed the knowledge's reach across the years between the recording and the release, and then managed the release itself through the coverage apparatus that positioned her account of the institutional management in the pathologizing frame that reduced its authority. The management of Diana's own account of the institutional management is the final instance of the pattern. The institution managed the account of the management with the same tools it deployed against the protection officer's knowledge, in the same direction, in the service of the same interest. The interest was the management of the narrative about Diana's life, the maintenance of the institutional version against the version that the people closest to her, including Diana herself, were attempting to provide, through whatever channels the institutional management had not fully closed. The channels have not all been closed. The record contains what they have produced. The pattern is in it. The management apparatus is in it. The gap between what the record contains and what the full knowledge of the people who were closest to Diana would have produced is in it, as an absence shaped by the management's operation, rather than by the management's complete success. The absence is the pattern's permanent product. It is in the record alongside the evidence of the management that produced it. The record is permanent. The management continues. Both conditions are the pattern's legacy, and the legacy is what anyone examining the full history of how the institution managed the people who knew too much will encounter when they look at the cases together rather than separately, in the light that the pattern, rather than the individual explanation, produces. The silence of the people who knew too much is not a single silence. It is an accumulation of individual silences, each produced by specific mechanisms in specific circumstances, each serving the same institutional interest through the specific tools that each circumstance made available. Barry Mannakee's silence is permanent in the way that death makes things permanent. Ken Wharfe's silence is partial, shaped by the review process and the obligation structure into the specific constrained communication that his public presentations carry. Trevor Rees-Jones's silence on the moments that mattered most is either the silence of genuine traumatic amnesia or the silence of a decided account, and the public record cannot establish which. Paul Burrell's silence on the specific content of what the trial's continuation would have produced is the silence of proceedings that were ended before their disclosure potential reached its limit. Each silence has its own explanation. Each explanation is adequate in the specific terms it addresses. The adequacy of the individual explanations is itself the institutional management apparatus's most durable product, the condition in which each case can be examined separately and explained individually, without the pattern that connects them becoming the primary unit of analysis. Diana understood the pattern. She described it on tapes recorded in secret inside the palace that was managing her, because no legitimate channel existed through which she could describe it through the institution's own mechanisms. She passed the tapes outside the palace through a method designed to prevent the institution from knowing they existed. The institution managed the tape's eventual release in the same direction it had managed everything else, through the pathologizing frame that positioned her account of the management as the product of personal distress rather than institutional observation. The frame was the management available. It served the institutional interest in preventing Diana's description of the pattern from being examined alongside the evidence of the pattern's subsequent instances in a form that revealed their relationship. The relationship is now in the public record. The tapes are in it. The cases are in it. The institutional management responses to the cases are in it. The gap between what the management contained within the institutional framework and what the public record holds is in it, as an absence whose shape reflects the management's operation. What the silence confirms, taken across all its specific forms and all the specific mechanisms that produce those forms, is not what the deliberate causation theories required it to confirm. The official investigations examined those theories thoroughly and found no supporting evidence. Their findings deserve the authority the investigation's thoroughness gave them. What the silence confirms is something the official investigations were not organized around examining: the consistent management of people whose proximity to Diana produced knowledge the institution found threatening, the consistent direction of that management toward containment rather than accommodation, the consistent priority of the institutional narrative over the accounts of the witnesses whose direct observation would have provided a version of Diana's experience independent of that narrative. Diana spent the last decade of her life inside the management's operation. She watched it move against the people she trusted. She described what she watched in the only form she could find to describe it in. The description is in the record. The management continues around it. The gap between them is where the truth about Diana's private experience and the institution's response to the people who shared it has always lived, visible to anyone who examines the record with attention to both what is present and what the management worked to prevent from being there.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.